because we are increasing taxes or introducing a new tax or whatever we do.
Obviously, you want to maximize the revenue that can come in on the existing tax structure.
Yes.
But I just, if you had collected another 23 million rand, you wouldn't have billion rand. You wouldn't have had to go on up, put the VAT rate up. That's essentially what you're saying.
Yes. And last year, as we were coming to the budget in 2018, it was very clear we needed a significant increase. And Minister Gigaba was a minister. He had to have lots of meetings because taxation becomes very political. People don't care much if you're not going to increase rates, but increasing VAT by 1%, I mean...
Obviously.
And the budget is always, people think it's Treasury deciding. It's not Treasury deciding. Ultimately, it goes through the committees of ministers, and it ultimately is adopted by Cabinet. Now, on the tax side, for the VAT increase, we certainly went to Cabinet a few times because it was obviously a hard decision for government to make, but it was a necessary decision, not only to fund the highest spending level, but to make sure that your budget deficit is sustainable. And the rating agencies were obviously also looking, are we going to now, and it gets back to that very first graph the DG had, let's just maybe go right back there, which if you look at it, with the MTPPS, the market was a bit spooked out because you can see that black line is not stabilizing, it's increasing, it's going upwards. Yeah. So when is it going to stop? At 65, at 70%, and it gets back to almost where we were in 1994, where your interest expenditure item was the biggest item on the budget. And if you don't watch it, here too, it's going to become the biggest item. So it squeezes out the capacity of government to deliver. And if the rating agencies say that our ability to pay is going to be diminished, it means that, and if we had gone to, lost our investment grade with, was it Moody's, that the cost of funding will increase for government as well. So even for the same amount of money that we borrowed, we would actually have to pay much more in interest. I don't know if you want to...
But sorry.
Okay.
No, finish this.
Sorry. In the ordinary course, if the process is working as it ought to, how soon would you become aware of material, of likelihoods of material shortfalls in estimated tax collection, revenue collection? If everything was working as it ought to, how quickly would you become aware?
So quite quickly, because we get information every month within a few days from SARS as a Treasury, okay, what they collect. I think we shouldn't get too excited for the first 3 months because your corporate income tax comes in chunks at the end of every quarter and not every month. So your personal income tax and VAT come in steadily. You can pick up very quickly because some are more linked to the economic cycle than others, that there's a problem coming, okay? Certainly by 6 months, we know quite well what we now going to, how much we're going to, what the under collection will be for whatever reason. And that's why we then adjust it, because month 7 is October for the medium-term budget policy. We then make the first revision on what we, the amount, the estimates and projections we had in February, in the February budget, okay? And of course, as you get to more months, by end December, it's now 9 months, and we've got the corporate taxes also coming in for the 3rd quarter of the fiscal year. And it's enough for us then to use for, we start projecting for the budget that's going to come next year. So we have 9 to 10 months of information. So we then say, oh, okay, it's even worse than we thought, and although there's only 1.5 months left of this current year, we might bring it down by 2-3 billion more, or we might increase it slightly. But more importantly, we use that forecast to say, what will we collect next year? Because now we might have a lower base or higher base. I don't know if Chris wants to come in. So you know, as every month goes by, we get more and more information. And I must tell you, one of the big reforms we introduced after 1994 was what we call the early warning system. So both on the expenditure side, we can see how much spending there is or underspending, and on the revenue side, we can see from the monthly information, which, by the way, we get immediately, as I said, after month end, within a few days. But within 30 days, we publish it in a government gazette, so that it's, you know, we are extremely transparent, hence the #1 budget transparency rating that we get, because we put all of this out in a public domain. Analysts are all watching these numbers, and when they see that the numbers aren't coming right, the market already starts reacting to this information.
Sorry, just one more question.
So sorry,
if I
can
may,
I just
on
say,
this.
if I may, on that. So when you had the problem of VAT refunds, the numbers, was it 2-3 years ago, 2016, where analysts, and I think at that stage maybe we weren't publishing monthly the VAT refunds, but it caused shocks to, and analysts already started acting. You just remind me by posing the questions. So I remember, and therefore they were forecasting, it was towards the end, so they were forecasting revenue numbers that were based then on these shocks, but they didn't know the info we had on the refunds, that there was a problem at SARS here. But maybe you should just, my memory is,
Thanks.
Chris, yeah.
I mean, just on that point, because the
Sorry, will you just state your name so that it's on the record?
Chris Axelson.
Thank you.
On that point, I think it was December 2016, there was a big drop in the number of VAT refunds that were paid out. I mean, because this information is made public, there was a lot of concern then by the private sector and others about what is happening. And then that was, I think there were some meetings between the minister at the time and SARS what's happening. We've got a chart on it later in the presentation. But then you could see the next month then a lot of those refunds were then paid out again. So it was quite a big variation, but it just caused quite a bit of uncertainty in the market about what was happening.
So when you get the early warning, you start looking at adjustments, etc. But do you then say, we're now seeing that there's going to be a revenue shortfall. What's the problem with revenue? What does Treasury do about that?
So that's why we have we would then increase the number of meetings with SARS. We would discuss this at various levels, what the problem is. And obviously, I think even in the minister's management meeting with SARS, which, as the DG said...
Actually, let me talk to you, because I would have said in those meetings, as Chief of Staff, when I was Chief of Staff to Minister Pravin Gordhan, so I used
Before
to...
you became DG.
Before I became DG.
Yeah.
Before I became DG, when Minister Gordhan was Minister of Finance between 2010 and 2014, I was with him from 2009 to 2014. I was with him from 2010 to 2014. For the 4 years, I would have sat in almost all management meetings on a monthly basis with SARS. So I would know the kind of information that comes through as SARS reports to the minister. And there will be dedicated standard agenda items on revenues and issues. And at the time, because then the numbers would show in terms of targets, targets as per the estimate, you know, from an early warning point of view.
Yeah.
Are you able to reach the
DG.
targets or not?
It's not a target.
Target in its sense.
Estimated targets.
Estimated
SARS
targets.
would regard it as a target,
Target,
when they come
yes.
to the meeting.
Yes,
That's what,
yes.
Yeah.
So in the meeting, they would have said for this quarter, our estimate, we want to collect, maybe let me say it this way, we want to collect so many billions for this quarter. And then there's a quarterly report that will have come through the management meetings where the Minister of Finance sits with them. And then it's at that point that they would be questioned, the minister would push, and they would demonstrate what they were going to be doing in the next period to collect more, what areas they would not have collected, why they didn't collect, you know, all the mechanisms that are in place for SARS, the phone calls, including the statistics, by the way, that they should show that we made so many telephone calls to so many people or so many companies. So that's the kind of innovation that was there in those years. I don't know what happened or what's happening now, but because I don't sit, as I say. But those years, you had a ministry which was making sure that SARS is accountable in terms of meeting the estimates or targets that they have set for themselves. So it's very important that we understand that if they were not met, that they should or they should be pushed by the ministry in this case. And that information, as National Treasury now, will only see it later in terms of when these estimates are now public and we are getting early warning signals that says things are bad. Like we already knew as that December that 30 billion was maybe, and the only time, by the way, we can, as Treasury, put that number out is only on 2 occasions, formally, in the medium-term budget policy, in the framework in MTUPS, and in the framework as we present in the budget.
May I read something into the record, please? I have an affidavit from Mr. Opal Magashula concerning his tenure as commissioner here. And it's something that verifies what the DG has just said. He says, revenue administration is governed by SARS and the fiscal framework and stability is governed by the Minister of Finance. It therefore stands to reason that the two must work very closely together. I would meet with the Minister of Finance twice every second Monday, which is approximately twice a month. Minutes of the meeting would be taken. These meetings also entailed reports being drawn for the benefit of the Minister of Finance. The issues covered at these meetings generally included the following: appointment of chief operating officers, changes on the operating model, revenue performance within the various tax types, governance issues, the security and economic cluster, SARS participation in international tax forums, SARS financial reports, SARS strategy. The Minister of Finance would give input and opine on SARS-related issues, in particular on ensuring that as much revenues was collected. I would engage with the Minister of Finance organically. In my view, one cannot become a successful SARS Commissioner without an intensive relationship with the Minister of Finance. It is nonsensical to refuse to work with the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Mamani, I've glanced through your slides here, but I think there are a few fundamentals that we don't need to be persuaded on. Number one, you need tax in order to have government. That's the first thing. Number two, you want to collect, maximize the tax you can collect. If you don't raise enough tax for your expenditure, you've got to borrow money, and it's very expensive if you can borrow at all. So I think we know those basic principles. As to the detail, there are a few things that, thirdly, there must be cooperation between Treasury and SARS if you want to be effective. So all of those I think you can take as given. There are a few things arising from that I'm interested in. What has been your experience in the last few years of cooperation between Treasury and SARS? Can we deal with that first of all?
Okay. So we'll just jump to those slides directly then. I think, so let me just for the record give my name, Ismail Momoniat. So I think we've said a lot of the Treasury advises Minister of Finance on the tax policy design, and SARS implements tax legislation to collect revenue. So therefore regular collaboration and frequent interaction is necessary. I think we began to see then a high turnover of senior managers, which was the first kind of sign. It happened slowly, a slow bleed. let's take the loss of staff from key units like the LBC and customs. You could see that, people were leaving, or mysteriously it stopped, it just got dismantled, okay? There's no discussion between Treasury and SARS on what's happening there. You got a sense that the leadership at SARS, and I mean the commissioner, okay, and some of the EXCO members, were really unaware the extent to which all these changes, what it actually meant on the ground, okay? The one indicator they have is revenue, but declining revenue comes with a bit of a lag, okay? So if the LBC is dismantled, or the way it was put that they are now in almost every office, firstly, it doesn't make sense. You're only dealing with, 100 or 2 will, it will be in the tax stats, will give you most of your corporate income tax. 200.
300 companies.
Yeah, 300. But
Well, we've
even
been told about 30% of revenue went through the
But
LBC.
even of that, you'll take the top 20, 30 will give you maybe half of it, or we can get the exact figures, okay? But it's, and when you don't have an intensive relationship with those entities, clearly there's going to be a problem. Now, we wouldn't know that they don't have a relationship, but the fact that the LBC goes down and you see the debt book going up, now we don't know amongst who, but those are the kind of early signals you have. When you talk to the SARS leadership, it's almost like they deny the problem, and I remember a meeting that Minister Gigaba had even in October before the MTPPS. They say, no, actually we're more capacitated because we've got more CAs, we've got more lawyers. Now, I take an example, Kwesi Low, okay, he's there for 40 years. He's not just a lawyer, he's a tax expert. He chairs the Global Tax Forum. If you replace him, surely you need to replace him. You'll never be able to clone him, okay? But you got to get someone who understands tax law. So when you look at the EXCO, they did not know.
Sorry, just a minute. Can you move that microphone a bit? Just a, no, I just want, I'm seeing half you, and I'd like to see.
Half a moment.
So what happens is you got a sense that the EXCO was really, as a body, quite unaware of the issues. And later on, what I say is, on the one hand, the leadership, and I'm going to come to the VETS refund story, because I think that illustrates concretely how things were breaking down. But when these issues are raised, even in a revenue analysis working committee initially, kind of SARS staff, I don't know, I saw the evidence by Dr. Carlson, I saw his affidavit, which I thought was a very good affidavit because it really described the problem. My only question is, were the EXCO so afraid to talk about that even a year ago? Okay. When you have an EXCO that everyone could see there was a problem, but yet, what he said now is, I think, very accurate. But, and I don't want to point to him. I'm saying EXCO members, they may have whispered to us, how bad things are, but nobody was willing to come out openly, and I suspect even to the ministers, and tell them just how things were falling apart, and how unaware the commissioner himself was of these problems. In fact, there was an increasingly intolerant of public criticism, and just go to the next slide. And the shock of it all was suddenly they attacked Judge Davis in March 2017, okay, and absolutely refused to cooperate when he's doing the report on tax administration. He can't even get meetings. And when he tries to set up meetings, and he even comes to the Treasury, and by that stage, his relationship, there's no relationship with Minister Gordon, okay. And so 10th March is when Mr. Gordon is still minister. It's 21 days before he gets fired. But Minister Gordon's not able to say, can you at least meet with the Judge Davis? I sort of thought lower down, because being in a public service, we know that sometimes there's always fights between our bosses. But as officials, it's still important. You know, two ministers can be having their own issues, for example. But as officials, the DG will still meet with his counterpart. So similarly at SARS, we would still continue to meet lower down. But it's inexplicable. He doesn't want to meet with Judge Davis. And when I talk to the people below and send emails and say, please, can you meet with the judge? And they're still too scared to actually meet with him. And they don't meet him. Okay. I'll give you another example. Once the Makwakwa issue came up, the commissioner mysteriously launches an attack on the FIC, blames everyone. For 4 months he kept quiet. Even members of his exco didn't know about the report from the FIC. Of course, we learn about it when it appears in the Sunday Times. I think it was the 11th of September. And then suddenly there's all action. But the commissioner then launches an attack on the FIC. I mean, there's a press statement which we can make available, dated on that date, where SARS attacks the FIC. These are two institutions reporting to the same minister. He's not even been to the minister to say, I have a problem with the FIC. Okay. Indeed, I don't think there was a problem with the FIC. The FIC did its work. I mean, in my job, I also deal with the FIC. We deal with anti-money laundering legislation. We had done the FICA Amendment Act, where there was great resistance to clauses related to politically exposed persons. And I mean, it's like I look at this and I say, but the commissioner does he even read the FIC Act? It also appears he doesn't consult with his internal legal people who deal with FIC. But everything is now dealt with by external lawyers to advise the commissioner. So already you just, and you're getting really weird advice and an open attack on the FIC. Okay. Similarly, so on a VAT refund, the Minister Gordon, when in 2016 they could, they failed to pay their refunds. I remember they came and they said there were two reasons. I don't know if you can find those slides. They said there were two reasons. One was that people took leave in December, and so therefore the payments were not made. And secondly, that there was fraud related to bank accounts, and they had to get VAT vendors to confirm their bank accounts. Okay. Now, here I was very impressed with Minister Gordon. Obviously, he was the previous commissioner. So we have this meeting around January 30th to ask them. They produced these reasons. Minister Gordon said doesn't accept the explanation. So he has about 3 meetings, in, I think I can get the dates, end of January and in February, where he basically asked, so how does the VAT refund process work? And he says, when I was there, I remember there's 6 buckets, and he went on to describe each bucket, each process. It was very clear the EXCO there didn't have a clue. Okay. Then Minister Gordon insisted on 2 or 3 further meetings to see in which bucket is there a problem. Okay. The commissioner didn't even come to those meetings. It looked to me like he's not even interested. Okay. They give, this weak explanation, but once you interrogate, they're unable to explain. And yes, then you have what's Fabian Murray and so on, the officials who really know, who are much lower down below the EXCO, who can actually explain and say, this is the problem, this is it. Of course, that process doesn't get completed, and we'd be able to dig up all the presentations they made at various stages from the ministry. Then Minister Gordon obviously gets fired. And indeed, even the rumor mill amongst EXCO is we've been told that the minister will get fired by April. must just limp along till April. I don't know where that came from, okay? But it did happen, okay? And when he gets fired, obviously you had Minister Gigaba coming, and, you know, every minister has a different way they relate to these entities. And, you know, then there wasn't a focus on this sort of fell away. Then it was left up to Judge Ngupe as a tax ombud to go into the matters. And there too, I mean, if you look at what happened was, they issued a report, and SARS immediately, I think that day or the day after, came out with a press release to say, you know, they don't agree, etc. Now, as public servants, I always say, we've got to have thick skins. It's in the public interest to be able to take criticism. And if somebody says this is not working, and you're so thin-skinned that you issue a press statement, you're actually saying you're not even considering the tax ombud's report to see whether there's a problem. You just deny that there's a problem. And it was clear that there was a problem. Okay. So, and then, of course, the VAT saga continues. You then have the Section 72 VAT Act ruling, which then sets a precedent, okay, that if it's true, I mean, this is press reports, that you then override officials within SARS, lower down, who say, don't do this, then it's done. So that raises all kinds of questions for us as a Treasury. I mean, if the DG is not a post office, okay? In the Treasury, you get memos. Chris will write up something, then it comes to me, I look at it, I might change it, but I approve it. It then goes to my boss, the DG, and the DG may well reverse that decision. But he will write down why he reverses it. He's not just going to do it because he doesn't agree. But here you have a case where it's not done. Now, that sets a precedent. And other taxpayers then say, and this is in a climate where refunds are not being paid. So others are coming to say not only are there delays on theirs, but some taxpayers clearly get preferential treatment, and, you know, it's all fast-tracked, and it goes right to the top. Now, that undermines the reputation of SARS. SARS has to be seen to be fair to all taxpayers. And the moment there's any perception that is favoring any taxpayer or going against certain taxpayers, that will, you know, sets us on a disastrous road for tax morality. And indeed, that's why I feel so strongly about it, because here you have a functioning SARS. And when you look at these incidents, and we've just quoted a few, if you want gaudy detail, just go through quickly. We can do this very quickly. So do you want to just talk about the 72, Young? Say who you are.
My name is Yang Amputa, Chief Director, Legal Tax Design, responsible for drafting the tax legislation. The problems we have is that SARS has to implement this tax act in order to do audit, and SARS has to implement the discretionary powers also in the tax act. And then now, with regard to the specific incident of a VAT ruling using Section 72, currently, Section 44 of the VAT Act makes provision for SARS to pay VAT refunds specifically in the enterprise bank account. So there is that specific section. However, Section 72 of the VAT Act gives SARS discretionary powers as to the manner in which the provisions of the VAT Act may be applied, provided that there are cases of difficulties and anomalies. So, gives SARS discretionary powers. So, SARS' decision of using discretionary powers provided in Section 72 of the VAT Act to pay the VAT refund to a third-party bank account other than the enterprise bank account as mentioned in Section 44. And SARS also issued a media statement on Friday, 16 March, regarding this decision that the Chief Legal Officer, Ms. Refulwe Mkwena, has made the decision, created precedent, and it also opened the window for requests of similar favorable treatment from other VAT vendors, because that's what we see now and we hear from the SARS officials that we deal with in terms of tax policy design. As a result now, government will have to consider the provisions of the Section 72 of the VAT Act that is in the next budget, as well as other discretionary provisions available in other tax acts administered by SARS. It is also important to note that Momo has mentioned the issue of mining rehab funds, because Section 37 Cap A of the VAT of the Income Tax Act makes provision for SARS to impose double penalties whenever a taxpayer has used the mining rehab funds in a manner other than specifically mentioned in Section 37 Cap A. That said, we have not seen that. As a result, last year, we had to make changes in the Section 37 Cap A of the Income Tax Act to take away the discretionary powers and to have a more transparent provision whereby the mining rehab funds, the mining rehab trusts, have to report to the DG of the National Treasury all their financials at the end of the financial year. So that is now we have to look at all the discretionary measures in the tax acts that are administered by SARS.
Sorry.
Thanks, Judge. Just coming back to this Section 72 and the discretionary powers set out there, and I think you've just made reference to the refunds to be made to the enterprise bank account, and of course you allow for in the discretionary powers for dealing with anomalies, difficulties, or incongruities, as you've set out there. Now, I'm interested how you understand the correct application of those provision in an instance where, for example, an enterprise bank account has ceased to exist due to certain administrative action by another functionary of the state. For example, if you've had a bank's account frozen or closed, what would have been how does the Treasury understand, in terms of the provisions of the Act, SARS would need to deal with an instance where a refund is properly assessed to be due and payable to the taxpayer, but that taxpayer, due to determinations by another government authority, no longer has a bank account? How would that be understood in terms of the discretionary? Is that something you believe is contemplated in the discretionary powers?
May I just add to that? The one thing the Act doesn't contemplate is that a taxpayer's bank accounts are all going to be closed down. So you can't use those bank accounts. Now, that's not contemplated. It's a very unusual event. I know you're anxious to answer, Mr. Mohammed. Can I just finish?
Well, yeah, no.
But, I mean, you end up with that situation, and as my colleague says, assume for the moment the VAT refund is actually due. And so a decision is made. Well, what I want to know is, and I think my colleagues, what does one do if it is not permitted by the legislation, but the amount is due because of this very unusual situation, never happened before, that the taxpayers' accounts are closed down? So now two things happen in some of these refunds. One is that they go to another account, the account of a related company, but not a subsidiary. The other, it goes to an attorney's trust account. Now, what's wrong with those two things?
So let me just remind you, Judge, we don't know anything more than what we read in newspapers or Daily Maverick about these payments, okay?
Well, assume you can accept.
So let's assume that that's the case. If it is that taxpayer, firstly, to correct Edward Kasha, Government of Baroda, to say, this is out in a public domain. I trust that you now know about it. I know you cannot tell me what you do about it, but at least they couldn't say they didn't know, okay? So if this account wasn't put as a high risk already, they surely have risk profiling within SARS. They could check. Let Younger answer, but because I agree, assuming that now your accounts are all closed and so on, it is reasonable that you then are able to pay in another way, but you need to then do it properly. There needs to be paperwork. I would presume you've checked why their accounts have been closed, because I would suspect maybe some of those VAT refunds are also been fraudulently requested if there's such a record of if the banks are closing down your accounts left, right, and center. Because I promise you, I think banks like people who come and do business with them. But if they're closing your accounts, the bigger question is why. And indeed,
I want you to assume that it is all properly audited, and if somebody can't come in and say, pay to my account instead of the vendor. But again, make the assumption that this is not a fraudulent account, i.e. that Oak Bay, we'll use Oak Bay, everyone knows it's about Oak Bay. Oak Bay, we know, has said, to whom the money is owed, assume, has said, I want it in that account. So it's not some third party who's diverting it somewhere. And if that is the principle behind the law that says pay it into that bank account, well, there is no fraud taking place. One knows that. You've got indemnities, for example, and you know that it's coming from the right source. Then you see where the difficulty lies. You've got an amount owing, you know that it's not going to be diverted to the wrong account, and the law doesn't allow you to pay it. So, because all the bank accounts have been closed, and assume Bank of Baroda is not one of the accounts that you can pay to, you'll see the difficulty. And it's a question I've asked. All you say is correct. One must be very prudent. But at the end of the day, SARS must pay even to drug lords if they're entitled to money back. I'm not saying these were drug lords, but you know what I mean. So what would you say to that?
I would say that in applying your discretion, you look at aggravating circumstances as well as mitigating factors. So if the bank account is closed, if maybe I was a SARS official in this scenario, but I'm not, if the bank account is closed, first of all, you ask why is the account closed, irrespective of whether the VAT refund has been assessed and it is due. But you look at the mitigating and aggravating factors. Is it really necessary for me to pay this VAT refund now? And what else?
It's due and payable.
It's due and payable, yes, in terms of SARS, but now you are making a discretionary decision. Yeah. So hence I'm saying that you have to look at the aggravating circumstances. What precedent am I setting in doing this? Especially if it's happening for the first time and the amount is big, and you are accelerating a VAT refund of this particular taxpayer, whereas other VAT refunds are not yet paid. There's that report in the media. So those are to me, that's what I'm saying, that those are the aggravating circumstances and mitigating factors when you apply your discretionary powers that you have to consider.
Now, I know you can say all these principles. I want to know what decision you would have made.
Can I judge what I would do? Every year we amend the tax laws, okay? They should have come to us, because if legally they cannot pay, then they either needed a change in the law, and we would have fast-tracked it, given this difficulty, etc., okay? Yes.
But I mean, you can't say to me, look, I owe you money, but wait, I'll change the law before I pay it. I mean, if you owe me the money, you must pay it. It's like my butcher expects me to pay him if I owe him money. But there it is. Anyway, you can see there would be a conundrum there. I mean, I understand all your points. You can actually launder money through the VAT system. So, I mean, all of those things, my only question is, assuming that it's legitimate refund, assuming that you cannot pay it that it's not been fraudulently diverted to the wrong account, there is a problem, I think you can see.
Yes, but I would refer you also, I'm agreeing, Judge, I'm agreeing that if it's legitimate and it needs to be paid, we will need to deal with this loophole. We've never had that, and the problem is every year we change our tax laws a lot, okay? And we would have done so, and we will do so, etc. Just as we were doing the financial sector regulation bill, now an act which regulates the financial sector, we've put in a provision which we're still expanding on, because we think everybody does have a right to a bank account, even if you're a drug lord, okay? So that, and some countries have a basic banking law. But as I said, in this case, the Minister of Finance was having this case. It was very clear that they still had bank accounts. I had, and I will make those emails available, written to the Commissioner to say, watch this, here's the case, etc. So there was ample documentation to read. And in fact, to my surprise, twice, within 6 months or so of each other, the Commissioner said, it's the first time I heard of it. So I sent an email to Kwesi Low sometime in 2017 to say, the Minister's taken this case, we have this FIC certificate which is out in the public domain. I'm bringing to your attention, they have these rehab funds, and SARS, will you make sure that they've not broken any tax laws? And of course, if they have, you are aware that you can not just take back the 28% deduction, but you can impose a penalty up to a further 28 times 2, so 74% would have been taken away, and that's revenue for SARS, okay? The issue then is that in February, Kwesi Low had already left. Minister Gordon had a meeting. It was, the Commissioner himself wasn't there, but the CFO at the time was acting, and Matsabani, and he, I mentioned it at that meeting, that I had written and have they looked at that. Immediately after the meeting, I wrote an email to him, which I CC'd to Commissioner Moyani, to say, this came up and whatever, because the Commissioner said, no, he doesn't know, something like, Kwesi Low didn't tell him, it's the first, his words were something like, it's the first I've heard of this, okay? In my mind, I thought, don't you read newspapers? But okay, it's the first you heard, but now you know. So now that you know, I hope you do the right thing and act. Then Minister Gigaba had a meeting in October 2017, where at that meeting, I raised this matter again. And he said at the meeting, he doesn't know about it. It's the first time he's hearing, okay? That same day or day after, I got back the emails and I wrote it to the Commissioner, and I see the, and I sent him the previous email that I had sent. So I certainly didn't get that there's any enthusiasm to act, and they're not collecting their money, and here's money to be found, but there was no enthusiasm to collect this money. So that's why I'm saying, if you take all of these facts, and I'll provide those emails, I think it will put a new light on this specific case. And of course, the very reason why this commission was appointed, I guess, is because we as Treasury can't go into these matters. And our frustration was, there's a series of bad news, and SARS can't come out and present a credible explanation. And this is impacting directly on tax morality. And so this is a leadership that's actually destroying SARS by not acting immediately. And I've said this in Parliament. If you are running SARS, you're not to be not just clean and seen to be clean. You need to be cleaner than clean, whatever I mean by that. If you're not, it's going to impact on tax morality, and that has huge consequences for the country.
Just a follow-on clarification, if I may, Judge. And putting aside the facts, I don't want to get to the facts around whether there were or not, there were no accounts. Am I understanding the Treasury to be accepting that in the event of the absence of an enterprise bank account, it is within the contemplation of Section 72 for SARS to exercise a discretionary power on how to then transfer a refund that is due and payable outside of an enterprise? And we're putting aside now whether or not there was a Bank of Baroda account or whatever. Let's put aside the facts on this. I'm just more interested in the legal principle. you're faced with a situation where there is no bank account. Let's take that as objectively fact. Is the Treasury accepting that under Section 72, SARS has the discretionary power to find a solution to dealing with that?
May I add something before you answer? It's something that puzzles me. I've come to understand that SARS is what it describes as amoral when it comes to tax collection. They don't care who you are. They want they want to get as much revenue as they can. So as we said, they collect money from gangsters and drug lords, and I accept that. However, when it comes to paying out money, as opposed to collecting it, SARS could become a very easy way to launder money. You overpay in the first instance, or you use these VAT refunds. Now, accepting that SARS is amoral and should be amoral, and drug dealers should be able to do business with SARS, is there anything in the whole nexus of legislation that would stop SARS not from collecting, but from paying out money to taxpayers who are known to be possible money launderers, for example?
She's our legal eagle.
Okay.
So.
Thank you. First of all, I think when you are a registered taxpayer, you've got equal rights as any other taxpayer in the tax system. So if you are a registered taxpayer, SARS will apply all the equal rights to any other taxpayer, irrespective of who you are. That is the first thing. Now, coming to the issue of using 72 and whether 72 can be used, I think when you apply your discretionary powers, you're going to apply based on your judgment. And I want to say, in my judgment, one would ask that, is payment of VAT give arise to difficulties, anomalies regarding the application of the provisions of this Act? That's what I would ask that. Is the payment of a VAT refund give rise to that statement? And in my opinion, as lawyers we can have 5 opinions in one room, there are lawyers there in the table, I would say no. And in those scenarios is that now, is it urgent, how urgent it is when the bank's account are closed, meaning that the money is still within the country and everything. So meaning that the money is still within the jurisdiction of South Africa, the bank's account are closed, meaning that the money is still here. So if the money is still within the state at SARS, the money is still within South Africa. So that's what I would apply in my circumstances.
But it's not SARS money.
It's not, yes, it's not SARS money, yes.
Can I just
I don't think we should go too far down this
Okay.
line, but I think the point you make is a good one, although I'm not allowed to express any views apparently before we get to the end. And that is, it's a matter of perception. I mean, if you pay out money to, in an unusual way to people who are notorious, and it's in the newspapers, and it's suggested that there is something funny, you better explain it if you want to keep tax morality up.
yes,
That's really the point you make.
and I
Even
think
if you are entitled to do it,
and-
if the press is saying this is indicating some collusion between SARS and the taxpayer, well, you better explain it.
And Judge, can I say, you see, in a normal situation, what would happen is if there is a legal problem, they would come and talk to us. They would say, is Section 72 appropriate? Because I'm not sure whether it is appropriate or not. And we would have to see paperwork. We'd have to see, we'd get a legal opinion, etc. We are not running a spaza shop, okay? So the point is
I'm not
that
sure that you're not, have you?
so the first thing we would want to see is all the legal opinions within SARS on this matter. So, we'd apply our mind before we consider whether for future, may not solve this problem, the law needs to be changed and we should go to Parliament or not. So, we have our own checks and balances before laws are put in. But yeah, so maybe
Can I come back to another, can I come to another point of view? Maybe you're coming to it in due course. But this cooperative, I mean, the Constitution requires cooperative governance at the end of the day. Forget about any other law. But how do you see the relationship between the Commissioner and the Finance Minister, and who has the final say, as it were? I want to take another example. We know in the public domain there's been reports of some conflict between the Minister and the Commissioner on, I think it was the payment of bonuses, for example. The Minister said, it's a time of austerity, you shouldn't be paying that, and they were paid anyway. Should the Minister be able to have the final say on that? Should the Commissioner have the final say on that? Or you're coming to deal with it? Do you want to deal with it later or not?
I can deal with it now or later, but I wanted to just make one point, is not only was, I think, what Yanga is saying, was the money paid out to another trust, but the money was paid to a foreign account as well. So if news reports are correct. So did SARS help with illicit, did SARS help with illicit flows out of South Africa? You know, is a question. And certainly when it comes to the issue of illicit flows, and looking at how the declining capacity at the LPC, and I think at Customs and Excise, and Chris will come in to show on the revenue, the actual revenue story as we saw it in our analysis. I think that there didn't seem to be the political will within SARS to deal with illicit financial flows out of South Africa.
Judge, before we move on to the next topic, can we just tie some things up here? Mr. Mamoniat, when you introduced this topic, you spoke about a more general problem with legal policy within SARS. Now, we've had testimony in that regard, and I'd like to hear your view. Perhaps it's Ms. Mputa's view from your side. But the testimony we've had is that the legal departments in SARS are in great trouble, and it manifests in two ways. The one is in the quality of litigation, but also in the number of cases that come through have dried up for SARS to fight. But the other, and I think this is where Treasury would come in, is that the development of legal policy, of precedents, of how best to use the legislation, the relatively new Tax Administration Act, that in the last few years, work around that has stopped, all but stopped. And I wonder if you could talk from Treasury's side about that more generally.
I think let's... Okay, just get to it, but let Yanga refer to that.
Okay, currently, I think there are two components at SARS. There's a component regarding legal and policy division, which is based in head office. Those people don't do audit. They are, remember, as Treasury, we are not in the tax administration, so we work with them, cooperation regarding the anti-avoidance schemes that are there because they deal with rulings. And then there is a SARS, maybe large business center, whereby they deal with audits, difficult audits, like your transfer pricing, your anti-avoidance measures. So what we have seen over the past years is that we have to introduce a lot of anti-avoidance measures based on BEPS recommendation, in line with the BEPS recommendation. So when we introduce these measures...
Won't you just define BEPS for those who don't know?
Base erosion and profit shifting.
Thank you.
South Africa is one of the 100 countries that are part of the inclusive framework on BEPS. So it also includes other African countries. So we meet, there are international minimum standards that we have to introduce in our legislation, and then there's BEPS 15 action points. So over the past years, we've been making changes in the legislation in line with BEPS recommendation. What we'll find, and then we'll have annual workshops to discuss the amendments in the legislation. So what taxpayers will say during workshops is that They question the introduction of difficult, specific anti-avoidance measures and the SARS capacity to implement these measures. One would say that that may be true, because maybe some of the staff at LBC have left. We know that is a fact. But the other point that taxpayers may not want this, and then they can use that as some sort of a statement, an argument, so if they don't want some of the anti-avoidance measures. So one would be careful with that. But those has come out strongly over the past years. And then, for instance, we'll introduce specific anti-avoidance measures for dividend stripping rules and share buybacks. And taxpayers will say that maybe there is no need for you to introduce these specific anti-avoidance measures, because SARS has got, in the Income Tax Act, there are general anti-avoidance rules, the GAR rules, that SARS can use to attack any abusive scheme. So that has been the signal we've been getting from the workshops when we do the tax amendments annually.
Sorry, that hasn't answered my question. My question is, from your side, we've heard evidence that there is actually a crisis in the legal department here in SARS. And I'm asking from your side whether you see that, or whether you would disagree with that.
What I can say is that in terms of, remember, there's litigation department, then there's audit, and then there's, and the number of cases. In terms of the number of cases, for instance, in terms of transfer pricing, that's what we heard from taxpayers. We still have to get us numbers from SARS. We are, for instance, before 2015, if you talk about audit cases, before 2015, there was a reasonable number of audited cases for transfer pricing. But after 2015, that number we have not seen from SARS.
You don't have a number?
We don't have a number.
It's because it's gone down to zero.
I don't know what I'm saying. We have not seen that, because before 2015, there was a presentation in Parliament whereby they showed the number of audited transfer pricing cases, the number of experienced people in the TP unit, and the amount of tax that can be collected from the audited transfer pricing cases. But now we don't have that number.
So there's less transparency?
I do not want to say there's less transparency, but I don't know if there can be a certain amount of audited cases. Maybe the question that to say that the number of cases have dropped, maybe that goes to that statement.
Sorry, can I just ask on that? Would they have reported that to Treasury or to Parliament?
Currently, Parliament, Momo is going to answer. We do, there is a committee for illicit financial flows. I think Momo has got the slides regarding the reporting there.
Wow, the thrust of the question, in answer to Advocate Steinberg's question, that you don't have it, did Treasury ever have it? Or was it these kind of statistics given to Parliament?
So maybe the DG can answer, because they do meet with the minister, and it may be that at those meetings such reports may have been presented. But it also gets to another issue that I raised, that under the guise of confidentiality, SARS has become more and more opaque about reporting any other matters. And I do think, and one of our suggestions on governance reforms is to be clear what confidentiality is related to taxpayer affairs. But that shouldn't mean that the way SARS is run, a lot of these shouldn't be reported on a regular basis. And I think that from our perspective, certainly the people who we deal with from the legal side who are involved on policy, the same people are there. They're not in the EXCO. Fortunately, they haven't left. And so we still have a good relationship there. When it gets to the legal people who do auditing, settlements, and so on, that's where I suspect that the units are not functional. But as I said, we don't get information on SARS internal structures. But when you see a lot of these problems, clearly it's in a follow-up on taxpayers and what happens that there's a problem. And to the point where, if you just go to my early slide where I was making the point that, we've certainly, before this, on with the data set. The thing that we notice is that, and our procurement officer will come later. He might be here already, okay. But they have their own information source, which, and what it relates to is there's a whole usage of legal firms, you know, Hogan Lovells, I think it's called MFS or Triple M attorneys, okay. It looks to me, and as we were dealing with issues, we're finding that nobody at SARS legal side knows about these issues. I would think that it would be interesting to see, was there any internal correspondence with these units, because when they say it's client confidentiality, but nothing stops the acting commissioner now and saying what was the correspondence, how did they secure their services, when they came up with reports, what was the correspondence between. But the more curious question is, why wasn't it done through their lawyers? In the Treasury, when we have our own internal lawyers who look at issues, and if they do need to get information, we do it through their offices, right? I mean,
Yeah.
It would be very unusual if the DG contacts lawyers himself, has his own relationship for issues. It's like his personal lawyer, and the legal structures within the organization are bypassed. And certainly I've seen evidence of that. And if you look at all these contracts, I would want to see what were they paid, was the procurement done properly, why were internal people not consulted or even unaware. It does look like it was only the commissioner and one or two people around him who dealt with these services.
Sorry,
Well,
just to...
two things. I asked the procurement officer to come in because I have specific questions to ask him about the contract with Bain, which is the subject of this, one of the subjects of this week's hearing. And perhaps we can attend to that when he takes the stand. And I've forgotten my second point. So, Professor Katz, why don't you rescue me?
May I just ask, leave aside, we're going to get to governance, and a lot of this is going to go to governance, but in past commissioners, just to answer Advocate Steinberg's question, would this kind of information ever have been given to Treasury by SARS, or is it only the current administration that doesn't?
I think, you know, it would not naturally come through from, you know, even now in my, I mean, I'm a DG now in the last year, and I would not ask, or even this kind of information cannot come to me or doesn't come to me because there's no need in the way we work. But I would expect that by just going what the former Commissioner Magashula's, you know, the issue that Advocate Steinberg read, those kind of, the information there would have come through that without the details. Because, by the way, even the Minister of Finance would not necessarily get to know the details. It would be, I'll give an example, it would be that we have arrested, or customs people confiscated so much worth of diamonds at the airport. That's it. As to from who wouldn't get those details. So it would be those kind of statistics. And such information would have come through. But again, it would be interesting to go back into history, because those reports were there, at least. I mean, I know they used to come with thick, big files for each meetings and make them available to the minister's office. So, but I wouldn't for sure say that information would
I suppose this is all going to arise when we discuss governance. Should this be compulsory information that flows from SARS to Treasury?
Mr. Mamonet, I remembered my second point. We had testimony from somebody from debt management, Mr. Nanunal, partly about the functioning of legal counsel within SARS. His affidavit says that while there are layers and layers and layers of approvals to get through in order to brief attorneys and counsel, In fact, the decision is simply made by the head of legal counsel at the end of the day, who can or cannot take into account those layers and layers of decisions. So that certainly is something that has been flagged and that we need to look into.
Sorry, Advocate, I think the testimony was such that the legal structures of that is so dysfunctional that there's sometimes a danger of prescription because they can't get authority to institute proceedings.
That's correct, Professor Katz. This is a separate point. It's about how legal firms and counsel get appointed. And
Anyway, I'm
Yeah.
not sure that's a matter that we should pursue so much here. We're inquiring to don't extend our terms of reference, please. Widen up.
President does.
No, I'm
Judge,
President.
should we move
No,
on
but
to
I
the
say,
question?
don't ask us to investigate things that are not in our terms of reference. Ask us to extend it.
Well, it all does go to governance.
No, I understand that. I mean, we've been here for 3 months. We've heard of lots of difficulties, and we'll look into them all.
Judge, should we go on to the point that you raised?
What is the time? Do
The time is 11.
you think we can have a 15-minute break?
I think we can.
Norman or Mr. Mamoniat, just for your guidance, you know, I've glanced through your slides. I also saw a presentation that was given to Advocate Steinberg, I think yesterday evening. I've glanced through that. At the moment, I'm not sure that we should concentrate too much on detail. You know, we have to report to the President in a month's time, and finally in 3 months' time. And a lot of these detail we'll continue, you know, we're looking at and we'll continue to look at. But what concerns me at the moment, and I think the rest of the panel, is, I mean, I'm sure you know of a lot of the evidence that has been heard here, and there are worrying aspects of it. But certainly my greatest concern at the moment is to form a view on how SARS should be governed and how it is being governed. I think that's a very major thing as far as tax collection is concerned for the present and the future. And a lot of the other detail you know, there's some overlapping with it. But let's not go down the road of too much detail. And let's talk about that broader principle of what is in fact happening in SARS and what should be happening in SARS. It might be that it's being governed well, and we'll have answers to all of that in due course, but that will weigh up. But try and just bear in mind that my primary concern at the moment is that, because it's you're still wanting to collect tax like from now.
That's just a small clarification on that, and what you regard as an appropriate governance model for SARS. You'll have seen that Judge Davis's committee made recommendations. Our committee some time ago, autonomy, what it means, all of those issues, if possible, should be addressed.
So should we move on to that issue now?
I think it would be helpful.
So maybe move on to this here.
I think you must turn on your mic, Mr. Mamoniat. Turn on the mic.
Okay, so I think let me just start by saying that, you know, we don't have an official Treasury view on how to proceed. Part of it is we are awaiting proposals from the Commission. And we were, in fact, on the point of publishing amendments to the SARS Act, and I'll come to those, on budget day. So Minister Kigaba had in his budget speech talked about the introduction of this bill. We then decided to withhold the bill, but I'll come to that and go through what we considered the in out, like through the audit process. We did not stress test our legislation in the hubris of 94 and after. And one of the commissioners sitting next to you may also have been, members of the panel may also have been a co-conspirator. But we kind of, you know, in today's language, we didn't stress test the legislation for bad scenarios. So if we were to do the PFMA again, I think we would have stronger measures to say, what do you do when things really fall apart? You need to have something. And I think in the same vein, though I did not have anything to do with the SARS Act at the time, 97, in developing it, but it had a similar kind of approach that it took. A lot came from the CATS Commission, and I say the subject to correction, but even though we dealt with appointment processes, we didn't deal with how do you deal with a bad commissioner, okay? And even now, when I know the President has suspended the commissioner, I know that as government we've relied on legal precedents that were set, say, around Masetla and so on, to say that that automatically gives the President the right to suspend and so on. So I think the big question for us is, what's clear is that the Commissioner is too powerful. The SARS Act's written where everything vests in the Commissioner. everything, the structure, the bonuses, etc. And even when the Auditor General found that the bonuses payments were irregular, I think he found on the basis that that was the practice previously between the minister and the commissioner. And in this case, the commissioner just went ahead without getting the approval of Minister Gordon at the time. And of course, SARS had its own, the commissioner had his own legal opinions that he was coming, and he wanted to take even the Auditor General to court. Now let me say, we would never want to take the Auditor General to court. These are important institutions, and that itself was astounding. So the first question that we want to look at is the powers of the Commission. I think the second point...
Sorry, I want to interrupt you at that point, because that is where I'm coming to, and that is this. I'm a believer that you cannot divide power. It rests somewhere eventually.
Yes.
Now, you might say, well, what do we do if we've got a bad commissioner? Now, your suggestions, I think, is that appointments should be by the Minister of Finance. And I say, what happens if you have a bad Minister of Finance? So, and both are appointed essentially by the President. Now, so it seems to me impossible to decide where the power should rest, because ultimately it will always rest with the President. And what one is looking for is only checks and balances.
Yes.
And so the checks and balances to me are the important ones.
Yes.
As I read your document last night, and I may be wrong, your only real suggestion was, well, change the appointment to the Minister of Finance. And there's very little about checks and balances there. I'm interested in the checks and balances.
No, and remember, we were only trying to deal with the urgent provisions, and it's, as you quoted, as Advocate Steinberg quoted, I think you quoted Minister Gigaba, or I think you said it, Judge, that if you don't have mature people, then we're in trouble. And I think what I get to later is that the way we appoint, and it's not a problem that's specific to SARS, we've got very poor appointing mechanisms, okay? Certainly I look at the National Prosecuting Authority, I think we have the same problem. I think Judge Musaneki a few years ago raised the issue that we have a constitution that's perhaps been written for Madiba as president. There's no checks and balances. So how do you ensure that even basic fit and proper tests are done? How do you ensure how experience gets taken into account? I know the DG here as Chief of Staff had some insight to even the process for appointing the commissioner. And you can see that there's almost no process currently. And the very basic checks would have said whether X or Y is good enough for their job. So if the state were just to be able to deal with the question of fit and proper and criteria, the experience, etc., and have a more robust process with public hearings and so on, I think that alone could, and not public hearings, I want to emphasize, to choose the person, but once the president appoints, should Parliament have a power of veto, okay, almost like in the US, where you have a nomination and then the president knows that if I make a bad appointment, information will come out and some parliamentary committee will obviously raise serious issues. Okay, so I mean that could be the type of check and balance that we could have. But I want to come back to. Do you want to come in?
Yes, let me come in there, Judge. I think it's important. I deliberately, right at the beginning, said the commissioner is just like a DG, because I was actually putting a phrase that I was going to end up on this point. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because as a DG, I know the president has got the final say in terms of my appointment or cabinet. Who can the minister remove me, or can the DG, I mean, can the president, who should be removing me? Is the president or the minister? And there was a system and a structure that appoints a DG in government. And And that process, even if the president has got the final say, the department will process that. Because I don't think when the act says the commissioner is appointed by the president, that it is actually the president who should be writing the advert, who should be getting all those 100 plus or 200, himself and go through. There is a process behind that. And I guess as a matured system is the one that understands that when the president appoints, it's actually a system that appoints, does not see himself as part of that. That it becomes issues about leave. Leave, a leave. Who authorizes your leave?
Yeah.
If there's an immature system that actually became at the end, where the issue is that who signs off the leave, it's not that, minister, I'm going to take my leave form to the president. Maybe we need to get those details. I don't know, because I was not direct in that office. But you find that those things came up in the open in terms of when and how does the commissioner applies for leave. There's small little issues. Who appoints the acting commissioner? Is it the president? But practice, and that's where our challenge is as a country. I mean, and Momo is right, what we have done, all it was based on good, minister, good DG, good president, good everything, without institutionalizing some of the arrangements. Because reality here is that it made sense for a commissioner to be in line or talking or engaged with the Minister of Finance, and obviously, the decorum that established that relationship is quite important. It was there. That it only makes sense that there's an approval process, and I've seen such memos, where a commissioner previously would have written to the Minister of Finance, request to be on leave, request to go on an international tour, request or recommend that so-and-so should act. And then it's up to the minister to, but now that at some point in this relationship in the last few years broke completely down in terms of who appointed who. I'm not accountable.
Very unfortunate. It's much worse if it happens there with the power to tax people and that than if it happens elsewhere. So I just want to make 3 observations. One, the method of appointment is important. 2, the checks and balances while the incumbent is operating to try and balance autonomy with the problems of political interference. And 3, the method of removal. And I think those 3 have to form a sensible relationship. Method of appointment, checks and balances during operation, and method of removal. But what we were very concerned about in the commission that I had the privilege to chair, and why we emphasized autonomy, is that political interference in the operations of a SARS could be quite serious.
Can I just add to that? Because I think the middle point is the one that concerns me most. We can talk about appointment, talk about removal, but if you're going to have autonomy, you've got someone in there for a fixed period. And what happens if that person goes, as they use the word in the revenue things, rogue? In other words, is there no one that he or she should be accountable to? Is there no block upon the abuse of the power? That's the central one. That's the one I'm most concerned about. Now, Judge, for the board having some power, you talk about deputy DGs, deputy commissioners. Because again, the point you make, I mean, the DG at the end of the day must take instructions from the minister. So there's that control over the DG. And so it's different in, you're not appointed for a fixed period with nobody to report to. Now, do you have any views on Judge Davis's board, for example?
Thanks. Momo will talk about that. Just maybe let me clarify. I agree with Prof. Katz completely in terms of your 3 categories. Maybe I was too simplistic in terms of saying it's just an ordinary DG. The reality here is that it must be totally independent, non-influential by the minister concerned. But I'm just saying in terms of a day-to-day workable engagement and relationship, that decorum must be there between how I relate to a minister, and so that we are able to. But in terms of the things that you mentioned, they're quite important, and I think the accountability is at the heart of this. If in your words, Judge, if the commissioner or gets rogue, into that, and how then do we? I'm of the view, and I think we've shared this with Momo, that there must be a layer of accountability, whether it's an advisory panel or whether it's a board, whatever it is, where they can keep the commissioner accountable. And the same decorum that is required of the commissioner should be the same one required of this board or panel of advisory board or whatever.
But now, does that mean that the board should be able to veto what the commissioner does, override what the commissioner does?
Yeah, let me
Sorry, Mama, just before answering that, with respect, take the board. With the board powers, there's two spheres that once again, just to try and define properly, would the board's powers only be on operational issues, taking leave, giving bonuses, or getting involved in how the commissioner makes decisions on tax matters?
So let me deal, if I may just go through all the issues. I think let's deal with autonomy. Okay. I think that, and Professor Katz, I think in the 1994 report, which I think was an outstanding report and certainly developed, I think, this work, laid the basis for this world-class institution. The concept of autonomy came up. In our constitution, as you know better than me, there's a concept of independence. Now, what's the difference between autonomy and independence? And can we, I think to the extent that when there are recommendations, we will need to go into more detail on what we mean by autonomy. And it does get into how do you make decisions on tax matters. And I want to just use an example, like of the South African Reserve Bank. It does have a board. Yes, it has private shareholders, and that has become an issue itself. But the governor chairs the board, and the board does not get involved in monetary policy. It only deals with the first set of issues that you've asked on the operational issues, audit committee, remuneration, etc. I think that it is important for any board to at least know that there's integrity in whatever processes, that there's integrity in the settlement process, there's integrity in, that people are fit and proper, they take lifestyle audits, all of those things, okay? They should certainly not get involved in deciding the tax matters of particular individuals. But, for example, if there are stories that the Gupta family is being treated in a particular way, we need to find a mechanism. I'm not sure whether it's the board or it's a tax ombud, but someone who can investigate and see, is it true, and hope that it's not true, and to take corrective measures more quickly, okay? So we don't have the answers, and we can certainly develop a proposal much more. But coming back to the issues you raised, so the first issue is, what's the process of appointment, okay? So let me get to the first point. I'm saying we need to know, what do we mean by autonomy, okay? That needs to be clarified, because it's not, okay? To the extent that the power is there, and whilst you do want the commissioner to make the ultimate decisions, there are processes that get followed when you make decisions. And what's the, and that needs to be spelled out, I think, more clearly. So when we are saying that there are deputy commissioners, you see, we had the same issues now when we were looking at setting up the so-called Twin Peaks financial regulators with the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. What we said is, let's start with the appointment process. How do you try and introduce roadblocks, or not roadblocks, speed bumps, to make sure that the wrong things don't happen? So we get an expert panel to come up with the names. and propose a short list to the minister. And I guess, Judge, I don't know how the JSC works, but the president can't initiate a set of names, okay? It's got to be names that finally get, you know, people apply, anyone can apply, and the president can tell anybody to apply. But you have a panel that goes through the list, does the fit and proper, checks for expertise, the criteria set out, can give the president 2 or 3 names. We can decide on those numbers. That is one way to check that at least the process of appointment actually works better. And I think we need that in the law. Secondly, I think that once they make an appointment, we are saying most decisions should be made collectively by the commissioner and deputy commissioners on tax issues, to the extent that the commissioners get involved. They will delegate lower down, but if issues come up, is having just one person deciding not a problem? Yes, the commissioner will have the, you know, if they split, can have the 2 votes or whatever. I don't have the answer, but I'm saying for the day-to-day issues on tax affairs and whether refunds should be paid, surely it's better to get 3 or 4 people making that decision, and each must know that they are then, in a sense, liable for the decisions that they make, okay? So that would be one form of check and balance. There's other measures of checks and balance that we need to look at. Obviously, what and how they report to not just the minister, but if you had a board, what are the reportable or material issues that they have to report on? And that gets to the board. If you had a board, what will it do? Yes, it can look at the operational issues, it can look at the integrity of the process. I would argue that it should be like the SARB, that whilst it may not be in line with King for governance, I think that the commissioner should chair the board, but you should have a few non-executives who are on, and when there's certain issues, it's the non-executives who decide, including when there's any investigation. If you look at the way the SARS Act has worked, like with the Kruin committee and so on, clearly we need to re-look at those. And when I look at the 2003 amendments, there was an issue of minister appointing a committee. The parliamentarians felt that would undermine autonomy. So these are issues that we need to develop further. And so I agree that we need to have more checks and balances once the commissioners are appointed. And I think that a board in a form that I'm suggesting, which would have the commissioner and deputy commissioners plus non-execs, could be a way of dealing with it. I think it was felt that the original advisory board, I think it was Judge Cobbett who first chaired it, that it was purely advisory, it had a role to play in the first period, but then that there was no use for it. But Trevor Manuel used to say, some of these things you need as an umbrella for the rainy day, when you have a problem. And for me, if you did have a board, would it not have been able to deal with the problems that we've seen in the last 2 years quicker and more decisively? I don't know, but that's the question that I have. We don't have the answers. Lastly, I would say, certainly we need to then have the power to suspend and fire, okay? And that needs to spell out.
Doesn't the president have that?
No, but I think that the issue in these things is always, you don't want the president to fire someone just because, say, the commissioner is getting into your tax affairs, okay? How do you guard against that? That you have a committee of inquiry headed by a judge, but somewhere in a process that's, I would say, less onerous than just generic law that you have. And in this case, for example, I guess we're following largely the Masetla judgment and so on, and the power seems to be just implicit. There's no clause that says what you need to do. So, again, we don't have the answers, but we're saying this needs to be done. Can I also say, just to get to the slide you had, I think that the technical appointment I think we agree with Judge Davis that you do have a minister who's in charge of expenditure and revenue. And if you look at the Constitution, only the Minister of Finance can introduce money bills. And money bills are both tax bills and appropriation bills. And there's an intrinsic link between revenue and expenditure. I mean, if in this instance, the president's not going to worry about revenue every day. He's got to worry about the country, obviously. You need a minister who's dedicated to this function, who can call the commissioner and hold the commissioner, him or she, to account on revenue collection. As I think the DG outlined, that would even be done in normal times. If that link is broken, I think that we will be in trouble. I think that we can deal with the checks and balances, but at the moment, do we look at the role of the tax ombudsman? Should they have stronger powers and the power to initiate certain investigations? You've got obviously the Davis Tax Committee, which is advisory and on policy issues. The minister said to me, we've got 3 judges, and you are the 3rd judge now, okay, around the entire tax process. So again, we don't have answers, but I think the question is, what should they report on as a matter of routine? What are the material issues that they need to report on? And coming back to the earlier issue of what would commissioners report to the minister, I think that in these issues, even the DG, I would imagine, if you had to put in law what he's got to report on, really it will be limiting and it will be a tick box exercise. But the DG knows what issues are material. And if the DG doesn't know, any DG, okay, doesn't know what's material to report to the minister, that talks about their own judgment and whether they really fit and proper for their own job. But you kind of realize what's material. In this instance, to me, you had a situation where there were lots of material issues. You know, the FIC says, Makwakwa, there are suspicious transactions. For 4 months, the commissioner keeps quiet. He doesn't tell the minister. I'm not sure if he told the president. And if he told the president, would it have made any difference, okay, at the time? So for 4 months, he keeps quiet. He apparently...
Perhaps not go down that road,
yes.
if you don't mind.
For 4 months, he doesn't tell his exco.
Let's not go down
okay,
that route.
okay.
Yeah.
So the issue is what's material and what's said, and how do you then respond once you have any material input?
Yeah,
So,
look, I understand all of that, and I think the principles
okay,
are articulated.
okay, I'll move on
But
that.
no, I just want to say one thing. You see, you talk about accountability, and of course all of those things should occur. But ultimately, some person
Yes.
is going to make the decision. Now, all I
Yes.
want to know from you, are you suggesting that the board should be the ultimate decision maker, if there is a board? Or do you say that the board is there to just restrain the commissioner, but the commissioner must have the final say? And are you saying, as far as appointment is concerned, that the Minister of Finance should appoint? Or are you suggesting that it should be only after a process? I think that's what you're saying. I don't have a
Yeah,
difficulty
I'm
with
saying that,
And maybe just before you remove, I want to tag on to the judge's question. And perhaps it would help if you could clarify to us the workings and indeed the statutory authority of the board of the Reserve Bank. And I'm more particularly interested in knowing whether it has any role in the constitutional mandate of the Reserve Bank, for example, relating to monetary policy, or is it simply assisting the board, the Reserve Bank, in its other responsibilities that have no bearing on the constitutional mandate? Because it would be important, as you answer that, for us to understand that would you be seeking to have the board constrain the powers of the commissioner in the exercise of his or her statutory obligations within the tax administration framework, or you're looking for something else? Because, and I link this also to the point you've also raised around the commissioner being tagged along with one or two or another commissioner or so in making decisions. And it's not clear to me of what moment is that. If you've got all the other checks around the commissioner acting consistent with the law, why must he be subjected to a syndication of his powers?
Look, I think the question is a very difficult one, and I think we should explore both options, okay, and look at the pros and cons more systematically. But my gut feel is that you want to go towards the Reserve Bank model where the governor's powers are unfettered when it comes to monetary policy and the board has no role to play. But in this instance, I think that there are other offices like the tax ombud, and the question is, can we sharpen their powers on specifics when a taxpayer feels aggrieved in whatever way? How do you deal with it? Can the tax ombud play a role? Yes, currently. But what you can't do currently is then go into that case, or is it the board? Okay. I think the board can look at the integrity of the process, but once you're going to actually find out, you have to get into the files of taxpayer acts, and perhaps the Ombuds Office better.
Can I just add one dimension? Forgive me. When we talk about the relationship between the finance minister and the commissioner, I think there's different dimensions. We heard from you this morning how the whole process of the running of the country, the financial management of the country, depends on borrowing, tax, expenditure, the relationship between it, and that's fundamentally the responsibility of the Minister of Finance. So an important part of that is tax collection. So that part of it, surely the minister in that regard has to have a fundamental say, because it goes to the whole management of the country's financial system. The tax collection is an important cog of it. So in that part of it, I'm not talking about how the commissioner administers tax, how he exercises his discretion where the Tax Act says on capital gains, if in the opinion of the commissioner, clearly that's of a different. I'm talking in the running of the country's monetary financial system. This is an important cog of it. It has to be the responsibility of the minister, surely.
Well, before he says it, surely, and can I add another different view?
Yeah.
Then you can think of both of them. If you're going to have autonomy at all, it means that the commissioner must have a fixed term. That I'm sure we would agree on. Now, as far as taxpayers are concerned, I agree that boards can't get involved in that kind of thing. But if you look at the organization, take this organization at the moment, where we've heard a lot of evidence, we may reject it all, but that's another matter, of low morale. There's this whole question of this operating model, is it working or not working? And assume the commissioner says, I'm not going to do anything about that. And assume that that is it's clearly not the right thing. Does your board step in and override him? I'm interested at the moment, these other ones of the, tax ombudsman's powers, I think, is not all that difficult to deal with. But when you're talking about running the organization, who runs it? The board or the commissioner?
It's a fine line between the board and the commissioner running, because then again we have to go back to the board and its responsibilities and the board and its powers and duties, and we have to define those and explain those in detail, and also explain in detail in call it the new responsibilities of this new commissioner that you're trying to build, as to what is that they do on a day-to-day basis, insofar as their accountability to the board, their accountability to Parliament, and what the relationship exists between the board and the minister as a collective, no, the board and the commissioner as a collective, in relation to the minister in terms of what Professor Kat's saying, because the minister's responsibility and the PFMA is very clear in terms of what Treasury, and the Minister is Finance, the head of the Treasury anyway in terms of the law. Both on the revenue and expenditure side, we've got responsibilities. So you cannot divorce the Minister of Finance and his role, and in the board in terms of what role they should play insofar as not limiting the responsibilities of the minister to only certain minor responsibilities, but obviously having all the confidentiality, all the autonomy in place. It's a new system that you have to build in. But I think removing myself from this conversation and understanding what it took for us to build a SARS from what it was to what it became, from being a revenue of, what do you used to call it? Receiver of inland revenue, to becoming a SARS that was competent, that we are all proud of. Let's look at that and what worked. And we can pick and choose what worked in terms of building or defining a new set of responsibilities for the board, for the commission, and for the Minister of Finance, and not in any way interfere with issues of autonomy and actually enhance accountability, including the role of the president insofar as hiring and firing, because this is not new. It has worked for many years. It has worked for many years. And for other reasons that I don't know, things started falling apart.
But DG, can I just interrupt you? You're quite right. The rules of the game haven't changed. What has changed is that you had a minister and a commissioner who worked together. They seem to work together very well. So, you know, it's not just changing the rules. The rules didn't prevent it working like that, and the rules haven't changed.
With respect, can I just say, Mr. Mamoniat has hit the nail. There is a distinction between independence and autonomy. What we had in mind on autonomy was to take SARS out of the Public Service Commission. That was the real reason for it, so that they could hire people, hire premises, and be competitive and run a good business organization. That was really what autonomy was about. No impact on independence. Now, I see the board as an administrative board that helps on the administration. It's a business board. It's got nothing to do with the functions, the tax functions of the commissioner. So we can really start drawing together threads. Autonomy means the thing I've said, independence, independent of politicians, and administrative accountability for the administrative functions of the commissioner to a board, but not his tax discretions and all of that.
You know, we could have a debate going for a long, long time on this, and we're going around and sort of circling the problem but not solving it. I wonder if we should continue this, if you think there's something else to say. Otherwise, I wonder if the Treasury could just think about this, and if you want to, just put in a short memorandum to us if you think you've now found the answer. Would that be okay?
Yeah, no, Judge, I think that would be fine. I mean, look, we've done some research. We've looked at other jurisdictions. We could give you a more comprehensive note. I'm not sure we got the answers, but I think the way Professor Katz outlined it, I think that's been our thinking.
No, I'm sure that's correct.
So,
yeah. It's a matter of now of getting to the detail.
But I just want to say, the question you asked, the rules didn't change, the people change, yet it was a very different outcome. And that, for me, is the interesting question. How do you deal with bad outcomes?
Yeah.
So we need more what we call preventative type arrangements, checks and balances that could help. And when really the problem's there, you need a quicker mechanism for exit, because SARS is really far too important to have a prolonged fight going on.
By the way, you know, we haven't yet found the bad outcomes. I think we have to look at potentially bad outcomes.
Yes, okay.
Just make one for light relief. During Cadesa, a friend of mine from Russia came, and he said his mother told him that the best constitution is a benevolent czar. The worst constitution is a malevolent czar.
But anyway, and the other thing, I don't know that one should concentrate too much on what they do in New Zealand and the UK. You know, my feeling is there's greater political accountability there. And that makes a very fundamental difference, I think. I mean, governments get voted out of power there.
Can I just add one other point, Judge? I think it's also important that there's more clarity on who comprises the EXCO of SARS and how they are appointed. Because I think that if you take the EXCO of SARS, you're going to have, if you look at tax collection today, especially with individuals, it's really an IT-driven process. So who's your head of IT also becomes a big consideration. The person won't be a tax expert, but they would know what is possible. Similarly, chief legal counsel, you know, we may need when we do it in a submission, that those are areas that we need to look at how even they are appointed, even irrespective of the commissioner and the others.
I quite agree with you, by the way, that it's a thing that is, I think, in our minds, and that is, it's not just a matter of looking at the leader, but the leadership.
Yes.
It's what one should be looking at more broadly than just the leader.
And more important, when they leave, I mean, do we know the reasons? You know, the CFO left last year. There's no reasons.
Well, there is a reason. Maybe you not know it, but
you know, but the point is that there should be a way that the minister at least gets informed, perhaps sees the person who's exiting as a one-on-one. You know, I think those are necessary. A lot of those certainly is not known to some of us.
well, I think a lot of what you're saying is you want to avoid the secrecy of the
Yes.
process. I mean, there should be a lot more transparency, and you might solve a lot more of these problems.
And SARS, often you get the impression that the tax confidentiality was used against people and to threaten them. If they ever speak on this, it's like they're going to end up in hell.
Just one question. I think my observation in all of this, which may not be correct, is that SARS was not accountable to Treasury for anything in the past few years. Is that correct?
But remember, we said up front, nobody is accountable to us, any public entity, but they were not accountable to the minister, really. That's the issue, but I don't know if...
Yes, it will differ. Like what I did, for instance, last year, you know, based on my office as DG of the Treasury, insofar as the cuts that were exercised across the whole of government, we cut the budget of SARS, and it then called for an engagement between myself, public finance team, and SARS commissioner on that. And then this time around, there was again another conversation between us, myself, and the commissioner of SARS, acting commissioner with management. And I'm able to say, it's not accountability, it's a management thing. I'm saying, and I will do it for any other department, by the way. We'll look at some expenditure line and say, no. You know, you cannot be budgeting for this. Let's, an example, say, they might have budgeted for, say, 500 million or 750 million for bonuses. And I say, look, I mean, and I know there might not be guidelines. I say you want the, you know, your budget to be increased. Why don't you reduce your bonus line by 200 million per year for the next 3 years? Then we're finding each other. But it's a relationship whereby it's in a budget framework discussion for budget for next year. So when you look at it, it's not like they're accountable, but in that way, I'm able to exercise the authority of the Treasury and saying, no, you can only, you know, your IT program, you want to change all computers everywhere in the country, and you've budgeted $1 billion for it. Why don't you do it, you know, per year, spend 200 million per year for the next 3 years? It's that kind of an engagement and relationship. Now, when you look at it, the Minister of Finance is not part of it. It's the Treasury in terms of those 4 categories that I said. Treasury will interact with SARS at various levels. So in that way, I take advantage because in the budget discussion because at the end of the day, we have to make that transfer. And in that way, again, it's between ourselves and and SARS, and not necessarily the Minister of Finance exercising his authority over SARS, and that's not the relationship.
Judge, we just flagged, I think, this slide, which shows you how, massive bonus increases.
No, I quite agree with you. I mean, there should be broader principles than that. It's one of the problems, by the way, we're told with audits. They've got to get through a number of audits to get a bonus. So, I mean, who's going to audit a major corporation when they can audit 100 personal taxpayers? But can I just ask you, I think we should leave it here, but I wouldn't mind you providing us with a short memorandum, and you say that, well, I don't think, I'm not sure that we will give you answers. I wouldn't mind a direct recommendation from you as to what you say the answer should be, rather than just a repetition of what we should look at, as it were. If you can give us that, it would be, you're not obliged to, but it would be helpful if you say this is how we say appointments should be made, governance within the 5-year period or whatever. So thank you very much.
Does this slide say that in 2014, 2015, there was a 41.26% increase in bonuses?
Compared to the previous year, yes. And if you look at the surprising thing is also their numbers have been going down.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and this, our colleague, Gillian Wilson, may know it better. We hardly as tax policy focus on these issues. But I think the issues for us is, even in judging whether a commissioner is successful, you can't just have one metric to say if they collect their revenue, then they get bonuses on the one hand. There should be other factors that get taken into account as well. And secondly, these numbers, I think, are interesting and does suggest that perhaps you win loyalty because you give people big bonuses, even though revenue shortfall started. And Chris will come in on the revenue story as soon as you like, Judge. But he would show that, compared to previous years, except for when you have a recession in 2009, generally revenue always, not every year, but generally was always better than initially budgeted. Our problem was we were always revising upwards. Come the last 4 years, there's a break. We are now only doing revising downwards because they're collecting less. And in fact, we are forced to also increase taxes just so that they collect more. And the old mantra used to be that, let's widen the base and you lower the rate. That just fell apart. Now we just increase taxes.
But with respect, over-generous, over-aggressive bonuses for tax collectors has its own philosophical problems.
Yes. Which is, I guess, what you're trying to say, Professor Katz, that you don't want them to err on a side that they tax people so heavily just to reach their target.
Precisely.
And that has an economic impact. But if you can go on to the revenue slides, because I think we were requested on that.
Before you move on that, I just want to understand, I mean, that's a significant growth. Was it ever explained what was behind that? And maybe as you answer that, if you could also just address me on the approval process, firstly in respect of the scheme, as well as payment under the scheme.
Yes, you see, I would explain with my, again, very vague knowledge when I was Chief of Staff. There would have been an independent panel of some kind, yes, Judy Puffett used to be. Oh. On the remuneration, what was it, what did they do?
Remuneration committee.
Yes, there was a remuneration committee that would have decided on the policy framework for bonuses. That will be the one that would have, recommended the amounts to be paid, etc. And then that comes to the Minister of Finance for approval. And then including the Minister of Finance approval for your EXCO, your chief officers, they sign off, and everyone would, and by the way, that would have, but again, there would be a process again, a parliamentary process of an annual performance plan, strategic plan, measurable objectives that should be met, etc. And again, we must have a historical, to be quite fair for the process even before this one. We should have a long-term understanding of what used to happen there, that it could have been, or it could be that even before 11-12 financial year, early days, I'm talking now from the early 90s, that maybe, yes, it was a measure of the target to be achieved that you'll be paid a bonus on. That was it. If you have to go into the archives, you'll pick up something like that. That says, but at some time, it was based on measurable objectives in terms of where they are. They introduced something called the SARS for a higher purpose in terms of their mantra that defined who they are. They were modernizing a big time in some way in the history of SARS. They modernized from an IT modernization point of view. There were milestones that they had to achieve. And all of those were a factor in terms of how much and when to get a bonus. If you reach this milestone, that's it. Do you use the same milestones that you used last year for the new year? No. But again, we then have to open ourselves and understand if we have to really engage and use this bonus as an issue, just to be fair on the process, that we again must understand what were the milestones agreed with the minister upfront. And I've seen documents where even then there were clear understanding that we have agreed, there's an agreement, there's a memo that the minister approves these milestones. Come year, financial year, and the memo that requests the minister to approve bonus will refer to that approval. Have we reached, have we not reached? Now, it will always be an issue about the minister and what he approves, including the percentage, by the way. There were times, especially when we started introducing haircuts in the system, from cutting budgets across the sector, that to show on one hand, you are cutting expenditure. On one hand, you are not only cutting expenditure, you have to demonstrate in the entities. We used to say that at the time. The entities that report to the Minister of Finance should also show or demonstrate that they are, understand the fact that the economy is not doing well, understand that tax revenues are not coming through, and that must be reflected in the kind of bonuses they offer. That was applicable to ASB, FSB, SARS, DBSA, everyone, FIC included, and the Minister of Finance. And if you look at all the submissions that at least I looked at from 2010, there would be a recommendation. The Minister of Finance would have a handwritten final approval. If it's 10% of your personal budget, the minister may say reduce it to 5% or 7%. And then SARS will go and work out what that means in terms of individual performances. Because the benchmark was the state, was government at the time, and say, look, you understand you're autonomous, you're outside government, but government can only be a maximum of 1.5% of payroll. And that's what we have to stay within. What justification, and that is the kind of conversation I would have with my boss as Minister of Finance, as I'm Chief of Staff in our office, in our own space, and say, we're looking at SARS, I'm advising him with one or two other people and say, it doesn't make sense when government is going that route and you are talking haircut, and yet SARS is giving so much, reduce that. And then we kind of convince each other it's the right way to do it. Now, in terms of what happened after that, it's very interesting. And the kind of defiance, call it that, because at the time, what the Minister of Finance said was it was clear defiance. And the fact that is the Minister of Finance authorized to approve or not approve bonuses? And that's where the issue is. And it's interesting, and I don't have the facts to know, was it at the time when the 41% Mr. Cutler, Advocate Cutler came? I don't think so. I don't know. Maybe we just have to get the details and say, was there an increase when the commissioner at the time took it upon himself just to pay irrespective of the approval or not? It could be, I don't know. I don't have the memos in front of me.
Thank you. Yeah. Carry on.
Can we move on to another topic? I'd like to talk about an aspect of the Auditor General's report and how it relates to Treasury. It flows from the discussion about accountability. Judge and panel, I'm going to lead a chain of evidence. Would you mind hearing that evidence and then?
We would hear any evidence that is worthwhile and helpful.
Thank you. it would be more valuable to hear it first and then ask your questions. One of the Auditor General's findings in the 2016-2017 report is that it's paragraph 29 on page 85, consistency of draft annual report information and achieved targets. And he finds, according to the draft annual report, that's SARS's draft annual report, page 29, revenue performance. Overall revenue performance in 2016-2017, paragraph 1 states, quote, despite challenging economic conditions, SARS collected the revised estimated target, which represents a 6.9% growth in total tax revenue from 2015-2016, end quote. We noted that the draft annual report indicated that the revised estimated target was met, while there is a difference of 300 million. Furthermore, we noted that the media report dated 3rd of the 4th, 2017, stated that SARS did achieve their revised target. The risk that the Auditor General finds is a possible reputation risk based on misleading facts presented to the public. There is a risk of incorrectly paying bonuses to staff based on targets reached while evidence proved otherwise. In terms of internal control deficiency, the Auditor General finds under leadership, management did not exercise adequate oversight responsibly regarding performance reporting, as the information reported in the draft annual report and media reports were not consistent with achieved targets. The recommendation, management should ensure that the information reported in the draft annual report and communicated to the public 16-17, stating that the revenue collection amounted to 1.144 trillion, which is fractionally above the estimated target. At the time the statement was made, it was clear that the revenue collected was far below the revised estimate, that 300 million. The figure did not take into account various items that amounted to 302 million. For example, the UIF collections that are not actually part of the revenue, but are simply collected by SARS, but flow out the following day as it happened. The SARS employees that were aware of the above financial position were put under an embargo by the Commissioner and were prohibited from sharing the actual collection figures. There's also detail to show why this was not in line with the practice of previous years, where previously the estimated figure took into account the non-revenue monies collected. On 11 April, once the numbers had settled and were no longer estimates, the final reconciliation between the media statement and the statement of financial performance was communicated to the Chief Financial Officer. And the communication, we have a communication. And this is where you come in. The March reporting was submitted to the National Treasury on 13 April 2017, showing the total tax revenue of 1.14 trillion, which equates to a deficit of just over 300 million against the revised estimate target. Despite knowing that SARS did not meet the target, the Commissioner continued to congratulate staff on meeting and exceeding the target. And that's an internal news flash after the final figures were settled, congratulating staff on exceeding the target. There has not been any subsequent communication to SARS staff or to the media or to Parliament that SARS did not meet its target. We have the details here, including the documents that were sent to Treasury in March. The question I want to put to you goes back to these questions of checks and balances and accountability. As far as I can see, Treasury was aware of the misrepresentation, but as far as I know, the public and Parliament remain unaware of the misrepresentation, and the Auditor General suggests that bonuses could have been determined on the basis of the misrepresentation. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, let me say, I call this the April Fool Day issue, okay? You know, on March 31st, SARS used to have a big event, big screens the last few days as they're working towards a revenue number, okay? Frankly, from the perspective of the Treasury, it's neither here or there that they under-collect by 300 million or, 1 billion or so. It's small in relation to the 1.4 trillion that they collect. And that's why we say this, I can see they need to drive SARS staff and hype people up, but, I think in the Treasury, we've always been more skeptical that they reach something they see as a target to the last cent or bit. And there's a bit of marketing on the 1st of April to say we've reached it and whatever. Reality is, we know in the Treasury, it's only when the figures are audited that you can finally say that they've reached their target. And to be honest, I don't think 300 million will affect a bonus, whether you pay bonus or not, because they've kind of more or less reached it. To the extent that they are deliberately distorting, I think it's a problem, or suppressing. And certainly on the 1st of April, we found the last few years that even the minister was not told the number, whereas by midnight we would be getting emails. We would even go on March the 31st. I think you were there even last year or this year. We would go to those functions just to show we stand behind SARS. I think even the Auditor General, obviously they don't focus on the way we would see management of revenue. So perhaps they're making a very strong point, but given the amount, I don't think it's a big deal. But it might reflect the culture within SARS that certain info which proved inconvenient kind of just got deliberately ignored, and the wrong impression is put out. I think when you see what Chris has, all these numbers ultimately are put out. Yes, people don't say, we exaggerated a little bit the announcements on the first, and you can sort of get away with it because they are largely preliminary numbers. And I remember this one, it was that they scored UIF. Now, I didn't know it was deliberate, but that was the case. Let me just give you another example. Last year, we introduced the dividends tax, or we increased it, sorry. They actually collected something like 6 billion just in February, immediately after announcement. Obviously, there's issues there that, especially if you're not a public or listed company, you could jipper the system, okay? So that got scored as their revenue, and they just barely made the level that they wanted. But actually, they would have been 6 down, and this was not completely unanticipated, but was as a result of the budget announcement to increase the tax, and all of it came up front. So, when we do the analysis, we're very skeptical of the press statement, what comes out. Our experts like Chris and so on look at it with a much harder hat and so on. So to cut a long story short, I wouldn't put great store by the number and whether it had an impact on bonuses. But to the extent that numbers were deliberately suppressed or information kept, that certainly is not something that should be the case.
But before, because this slide is very important in terms of it just explaining what it means. But let me give you a very practical situation, which is a problem generally. End of year is 31st of March, say for 17-18. This year, 31st of March, that's when, you know, the financial year ends. And state entities, including SARS, will have the 31st of May to submit the financials, and the 31st of August to publish the annual report. And that's the number we'll go by. Now, and the 31st of August is quite important because it then is a reporting on last year's performance. Then ask yourself, when do most government departments and SARS pay bonuses? They pay bonuses before August, mostly. We can double check the dates and the trends in the last 10 years. So you pay before you have finally tabled your performance for the year, and your questioning and questions in terms of whether you've achieved or not. So in any way, what we then tend doing, which is a problem in government, and is an area of reform that we must focus and concentrate on, is that you even go to a point of paying before the annual report is tabled. That determines, and you are questioned on it, whether you've achieved or not. And by the way, the Minister of Finance, or any minister for that matter, should then sign off on this report. It could happen that 2 weeks or even months before the Minister of Finance signs off on your performance, that you would have paid off your performance bonus for the year that's in question. So that, in a way, is an anomaly that I think the system must just recognize. But this slide is important to answer the second part of your question in terms of whether targets are reached. And is it a target? Because remember, your strategic plan, which comes into place from 1st of April, would be signed off based on a number that is your budget review number. That is the target that's there, which in this case becomes the original number that determines whether you've achieved or not, irrespective of whether that number is going to be revised in the year, meaning in MTBPS time when it's revised downwards. In this case, 993, for instance, would have been your target in that 14-15 financial year. I can imagine anyone's, including SARS, for instance, would have said, we will pay bonus if you exceed that 993. And because that 993 number comes in February, it's announced in February, meaning it starts to be relevant from 1st of April 2014 in that case. SARS strategic plan would also be relevant for 1st of April 2014, indicating in their plan that we want to reach that number. When you go back to that number the following year, that's the number you should be looking at, and not the number that is 983. So then when they then make their determination whether they've achieved or not, anyone says, oh no, I have achieved my revised number. But that's not the number that was used in the strategic plan, because the number that should have been used was 993. So then your answer then becomes, is it correct to base your number on 993 or 983? But let me ask Chris to explain how the relationship works between those numbers and the rate numbers, because that's quite important for understanding.
Thanks. I mean, I must say, we get the preliminary numbers from SARS. We always take them with a pinch of salt, because they are changed, and they are always changed. I mean, it's the first I've heard that it was a different process than previous years, which is worrying to me. But you know, in terms of the number that, you know, does Parliament know, do other people know whether the target has been met or not? We publish the audited figures. So Parliament certainly know that, you know, the revised estimated budget was actually a bit better than the final audited outcome. But, I mean, just to carry on with what DG was saying, you know, we don't think that's the correct way of looking at this at all anyway. this looks like a complicated slide, but it's just to try and show you the process. If you look at the top panel, the dotted lines are our forecast for monthly revenues. So you can see the big spikes in June, and there's another big spike in December, which is the corporate returns. And the red line is the actual. And in the bottom portion, that bar chart shows how much we've undershot the forecast through the year. So for last year at the beginning, we made a forecast, 6 months go by, and then in the first red circle, we're about 25 billion down on our forecast. So we have a RORC meeting, we all sit together, we discuss this, and we revise the estimate of how much tax we will get all the way down to 50.8 billion, which is that very, very bottom dotted line. So, we think we're only 25 billion now, middle way through the year, but we think we're going to end 50 billion down. And then we carry on through the year, and then in the second...
At the end of the year.
Yeah, at the end of the fiscal year. And then at the second red circle, we're about 39 billion down at the time of the budget. And then we revise the estimate again, and we say, well, we think the full year will be down by about 48 billion. Now, you see a lot of the statements have been made comparing to that very last estimate. But if you look at that chart, there's only a month and a half left to go in the year. So basically, you're excluding the performance or the ability or the effectiveness of the institution for, 10 and a half months. And then, we put a revised estimate, which the DG has spoken about. We can't create excessively over-optimistic targets, for SARS. We need to have a best estimate, because this number flows through to government expenditure. It flows through to our debt-to-GDP ratio. It's looked at intensely by analysts to see whether we are being excessively over-optimistic, and it will affect the credibility of our publications and of government as a whole if we start making numbers up. So that's an estimate of what we really think we're going to achieve. So we don't think that it's useful to look at the final revised estimate with a month and a half to go. You've got to look at the full year of the estimates, and that's where all these shortfalls come from. So if you look at, this is the chart just to show all our shortfalls. Compared to the budget in the previous year. So in 2006, 7, 8, we had big surpluses. It was fantastic. Additional revenue that we never thought we'd get. Large 60 billion shortfall in 2009, and then small changes. And then in the last few years, we've had much bigger decreases in revenue. So, I think that's the main point that we're trying to make, is that you need to look at these type of comparisons for effectiveness of the institution. Now, the big point is here, there could very well have been large reductions in the economy that weren't forecast. So actually, you could have big shortfalls which are due to the economy. If the economy underperforms, everybody thought the economy would do very well, but it doesn't, then SARS, of course, would collect less. And I think that's the second part of the question. Shall I carry on with that, or shall I?
It probably is convenient. We had asked the Treasury to look at to what extent the projected shortfall and the previous shortfall can be accounted for by a sluggish economy, and to what extent it can be accounted for by subpar tax administration, tax collection. And perhaps we can go into that.
Yes, that's fine. Can I just ask you one question at the outset on that, though? Are you able to give us a figure and say that figure, that portion of the 50 million was due to poor tax collection by SARS? I think the answer is no.
Yes. The answer is no.
Yes, the answer
yes,
is
the answer
no.
is no.
So, you can't, we heard, for example, a gentleman, I recall his name, Cecil
Morden.
Morden, dealing with that, and he did I'm sure, a very thorough job, and he couldn't come up with an answer. And I don't think he would be able to come up with an answer.
So there's a nice quote I like from George Box, a statistician, and he said, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yes.
And I think by doing this, you can get an idea, and
Okay.
at least the way that we think about what the impact of the economy will be.
Well, can you just tell me your conclusion, and then you'll tell us how you got there?
Okay, so, the conclusion is that it does look for some individual tax items that it was largely explained by the economy. If you look at import VAT, if you look at customs duties, we had forecast very large increases in nominal imports, but actual imports were drastically lower in the actual year that happened. So there was a huge decrease in imports, and then the taxes related to those imports were less, and so you had big shortfalls in those. So that does look as if it is explained by the economy. However, for other tax instruments, if you look at personal income taxes, for example, there was a very small change down in wage bill, which is the main determinant of personal income taxes. Yet there was very, very large shortfalls in personal income tax. Now, a portion of that, which I try and go into detail, can be explained by things such as policy measures. We did a big retirement reform change that was probably cost a lot more than we put in our forecast. So even after taking out a big 7.5 billion for retirement reform changes, there is still unexplained drops in personal income tax collections that don't seem to be explained by changes in the tax base.
Approximately how much are you talking about there? Do you know?
Well, so I mean, the way we do it, the initial point estimate, which is to be taken like all models as just a range, is about 40% of the shortfall in the 2017-18 year. According to this model, which I've tried to be very transparent about, isn't explained, and it could be due to some other reason. Now, and this is the point where I'm trying to say that it's useful just to look at this to say, well, it is suggestive of something. It's certainly not definitive, and we're not trying to be definitive here, but it does seem as if there's this disconnect. And if statements are made that it is certainly all up because of the economy, you know, these type of models can help to say that, well, it actually doesn't look like that if you look at the underlying data.
Well, if you look at some of the evidence we've heard that people aren't putting in tax returns, I suppose that's an indicator too. If it's true, if it's correct, we'll still have to look at all of that.
And that was the other tax instrument that does seem to be underperforming compared to what the tax base has done is a domestic value-added tax. And I think there were statements by some SARS officials that there had been a spike in the non-submission of returns for pay-as-you-earn and for value-added tax. And that correlates with what we see here in terms of this data. And I mean, because if you were ever going to check, well, how has their performance been in terms of the economy, you want to look at independent data. And this is independent, you know, Stats SA calculated data on consumption. You know, and value-added tax is a tax on consumption. So now you're looking at a completely separate source, and you're seeing how that's changed over the year, and then you're looking at the collections for value-added tax. And then that's the sort of approach that we were trying to use.
Can I just ask one question on that?
Can I just say
told, as Advocate Steinberg said, that the large business centre accounted for 30% of the tax take. The dismantling of that, how would this fit in to, how would you estimate that impacted on tax collections?
So that's quite difficult, because I'm assuming that would relate more closely to corporate income taxes. Now, corporate income taxes is exceedingly volatile. So personal income taxes is relatively stable. It's based on the wage bill, and the wage bill doesn't change dramatically. Value-added tax is based on consumption. Consumption doesn't change dramatically, but profits of companies really do change dramatically. So we've, you know, in the work that we've done at a high level, it doesn't look as if there is a huge problem with corporate income taxes from this high level. Now, I don't, you know, so it won't necessarily fit with those type of or those type of, that type of evidence on an individual basis. But it could just be a shortfall of the model. But we certainly can't say anything about that.
There's another tax that Mr. Morgan talked about, and that is excise on tobacco. He suggested there's a problem there, indicated in the figures. And I suppose there might well be if you've got no one inspecting the factories, for example. Do your figures show anything significant as far as tax of tobacco is concerned?
Yes.
And I think this might also apply to liquor and textiles.
Yeah. So I've got a chart there which shows the red line is the red line is actual, and then right at the end is just our forecast for the last year. Now, there has been a greater than 20% decrease in tobacco excise duties over the last year alone. So you can see the actual, you know, excise duties leveled off and then decreased. Now, as Mr. Morden said, part of that is there was a tobacco manufacturer left the country, So domestic excises would have gone down, but this adds domestic and import. And you can just see there's this shortfall. How can you explain that shortfall? Have 20% of people, or has the prevalence of smoking decreased by 20%? Or has the prevalence of vaping, which could be another suggestion for why you're not taxing it, increased by 20%, taken over? In our view, that's very unlikely. I mean, this does look, in our view, as if it is evidence of greater illicit tobacco, which is just not being taxed.
Could I, Rebecca Steinberg, am I correct in saying that Randall Collinson and Dr. what was his name?
Malavelo.
Yes, both said, using colloquially, that they didn't buy that the economy was a significant reason for the reduced tax take. Am I correct in?
You are correct.
What did you say about that?
So the work that we do does appear to show that that's true. So it doesn't look as if the economy was the full reason for the shortfalls. It looks as if there were other reasons. Now, that other reason might come out later as some tax policy change that we didn't estimate correctly. We can't say for sure, but there certainly is evidence that it wasn't the full economy. I just want to point to one other issue that was discussed previously, and it's the value-added tax refunds. This is data on the credit book, which is published by SARS in their annual report. So it shows how much does SARS owe to taxpayers in VAT refunds. And if you look at, it's from 2012 onwards. If you look, it's increased 18 to 21, 21 to 25, which was a 20% jump, 25 to 33 billion, which was a 30% increase. So there was a 30% increase in how much SARS owed to taxpayers in VAT refunds. Now, we would have expected just a priori that those amount of refunds should grow by the value of VAT, which was about 7.5%. So a 30% increase is much higher. And if they now owe SARS that amount extra, in effect it's saying that because it's done on a cash basis, revenue has increased in that year. But if you look in the later years, it now decreases. And SARS have done a lot of effort to then decrease their credit book for value-added tax refunds. So now, if you're actually decreasing the credit book in those later years, it means you're actually giving out more money, and actually the revenue collections are lower. So overall, across the time period, you're no better off, but it's shifted income from the later years to the earlier years. So the later years actually look a little bit worse off than they would have normally, but the earlier years look a little bit better. So even taking those, so we spend quite a bit of time trying to take these effects out and say, well, that's not SARS's fault in the later years to have higher VAT refunds. So you take that out and pretend that that's the same as an economic impact. And even after that, there's still unexplained shortfalls.
Right.
Credit book.
Huh?
Mr. Ackelson, is there anything you'd like to add on this question?
No, I was just going to say, I think the other objective factor which we may not have here, but is to look at their debt book as well. Those are objective factors which show you, that's shouldn't be linked to the state of the economy. So whether that goes up or down, or does it go up more than before or less than before, it kind of can indicate an element of trying to play with the numbers.
Debt book has ballooned.
Yes, which tells you that their capacity to collect is down, presumably, okay? And therefore, how much do you attribute to that as a factor for not collecting the revenue? And just go back to your slide, the first one that you showed, because I think, the bars that you had.
On the short.
Yeah. I think if you look at, that one. Yeah. No, not this one.
Once you're moving to those slides, of course.
So I just want to show, I think if you look at this, I suspect if you look at the 10 years before 2006, you'll find the bars are all positive, okay? So there's a long trend of SARS collecting much more, and we can give you, maybe we can extend going backward, okay? When 2009 comes up and 10, we get a shock. Obviously, we're following the global financial crisis very carefully, but that recession that you had in the world was almost a depression, not just a recession, okay? And 1 million people lost their jobs. Even though we did not have a financial sector crisis, our banks, were managed well and did not suffer, okay? Because once Lehman went down, it impacted immediately on European banks and so on. But so the fall there could be explained. It was massive. We were in a deep recession. Then, of course, we recover the next 2 years. And, okay, we have 12 billion. I must go back into it. But if you then see from 2015, there's consistent decline, revenue shortfalls. And that now seems to have become a pattern. And I think, as Chris has said, when we put our revenue projections, the market is looking at it. You really can't jippo the system, because analysts are looking at it, and if they feel that we are just playing with the numbers, they will certainly you get punished in all kinds of other ways.
So just to add on that point, I mean, we try and be very transparent with this process. Some commentators have looked at the buoyancy between year to year, and they say Treasury, sorry, I'm just trying to find the slide there. Treasury has these excessively optimistic forecasts, which will be very difficult for SARS to achieve, and it's almost implying something there. But it's really not. And, we publish in the MTPBS, which is the slide is showing, all our assumptions on every tax base, how we think it will react to the economy, our assumptions for the wage bill, nominal, net operating surplus for corporate income tax, imports. So we're very open and transparent, which I think leads to part of this being so ranking well in this budget index. But analysts can look at that, and we hope that that information shows that we're not trying to do anything with these numbers. These numbers are too important that we really are doing our best, including through the RORC process with these other institutions, with all the expertise that they bring in, just to create a best estimate. And that's the main focus of what Treasury is trying to do with our revenue forecast.
Well, I suppose that's where the cooperation between SARS and Treasury plays a very important role, is in fixing these figures. And if you don't cooperate in doing that, you get the figures wrong, as it were, or different.
Yes, and I mean, SARS play a vital role in the RORC that we talk about,
Yes.
because they have this expertise about what exactly is happening on the ground. If a tobacco manufacturer leaves, it has a huge impact on domestic excise duties that we would never know about unless, they were the ones seeing that type of information. So they play a critical part in the RORC that gives us a lot of information that we don't see, as well as the SARB, which they see a lot of information that we don't see. So an interesting little side note on this RORC process is that the Reserve Bank did an analysis and looked at all our previous forecasts, from the individual players in RORC, and they found that the margin of error of every individual player was higher than the actual RORC outcome. So if any one individual player was going to forecast, they would actually do worse than the RORC itself, and I think it's a fundamental reason for why we have that process.
I should also just add, Judge, that in most years there'll be some once-off thing, like I said, with the dividends tax, but more a very rich taxpayer too, or some settlement which one year gave quite a few billion. Okay, you can almost guess who it was, but because very few people are that rich. But you can, because there's an announcement in the JSE, someone selling their shares, this, that, and boom, there's a once-off or some settlement. Okay, so that's just a factor to take into account. But it might be big, 2, 3, 4 billion, but it's still small in relation to the total to be collected.
Also, we put this together with other evidence we've heard. So Dr. Malavela, for example, showed declining compliance rates, particularly with PIT and CIT, which tells its own story. We also have heard from many witnesses that SARS's enforcement teams, particularly in respect of the illicit tobacco industry, were closed down. So that again would tally with what Mr. Axelson was saying about the hole in the revenue collection there. So I guess one can also form a picture that way.
They would correlate, in other words. They should correlate.
Yeah. And just coming back on the excise, I don't know if you showed the tobacco. Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much. It's been very helpful and very informative.
Oh, we've got two more topics.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
You want two more topics.
Two more topics. It is 1 o'clock, so I'm not sure how we want to handle this.
What are the two other topics?
The two other topics are the procurement question and the Border Management Authority bill.
Yes. Okay. Can I say just on procurement, our official, for some reason, is not able to come. Maybe we can get him in the next day or two. I don't think it'll be very long so we're not going to deal with it. None of us here deal with.
Can I just have an idea? Procurement, what are you going to be telling us about procurement?
It's my questions. I've now the documents about Bain's procurement, and the questions that I'd like to put to the Treasury about the regularity or otherwise of certain steps in that process. So we do need the procurement specialist to be here.
And what, just when I did speak to him yesterday, he said there were applications, what they call expansions and exemptions.
Deviation.
And so they would be able to talk to you about that. With regard to the Border Management Authority, I think what's been of concern, obviously on the one hand, you have customs capacity that is going down, okay?
Mr. Mamoni, if I can just stop you. Not everyone has a context for this.
Okay.
So perhaps you could just start by talking about what it is and the differences that it's going to bring into our legislative framework.
Okay.
Are we going to do that after lunch, did you say?
I
Not
can
quite
be
sure,
very
Mr.
short.
When you said it, is that it?
This is the last topic now, so perhaps we should just hear it and then have a bit of a later lunch.
That's fine, yes.
So I think as you saw, even I saw in Dr. Carlson's input about how the structuring happened. But let me go back to the CATS Commission. I think the big issue there was it brought in inland revenue and customs and excise. You had two, was it Commissioner for Inland Revenue and Commissioner for Customs and Excise. Customs and excise, I mean, I forget the figure now, but we're looking at about 300 billion rands at least of revenue is collected through that customs and excise, import, VAT, etc., if you take all of these taxes together. There's been a kind of initiative that's been led in government to create a border management authority, which we support, for a more coordinated approach to the movement of people and goods and services coming in and out of our country. Where we've differed in this bill is, SARS has a major initiative on customs modernization, which started a few years ago. There's about 4 acts of parliament that will replace the current customs and excise legislation, and they are in the process of being implemented. So we've had issues then in Parliament about the breakup of this customs function from SARS, and we've said it will break the revenue change. It will bring risk to up to 300 billion rands of revenue, okay, at its worst. And I think what we've also said is that there's been no proper study done. A lot of this has been driven from a security perspective rather than a revenue perspective. And we've said that given the 300 billion rand, you would have you'd really increase the scope not just for evasion, but I would submit even for all kinds of illegal activities, and your illicit flows could increase dramatically. This bill is up before the second House of Parliament. There's been a lot of issues. There's also very funny that Minister Gigaba was proposing it on the one side when he was Home Affairs, then he was Minister of Finance. I'm not sure what his view is to this day, whilst he was Minister of Finance, and he's now back at Home Affairs. But I think that for us as a Treasury, we think that there needs to be mandatory coordination between various agencies. But if this function is split, it's really not taken the implications on revenue into account and the scope for more evasion, and it would disrupt the customs modernization program quite significantly. And really there's no proper study that's been done onto why it should be broken up. Those who are advocating it, I think, oh, but you don't collect money, the money comes through electronically, you don't collect much, it's like collecting money for passports and so on. It's nothing of the sort. It's what's behind the scenes, the underlying risk profile engines that SARS has to have, and breaking that, what they call vertical chain, that will really cause problems. So all we've argued is that if the Minister and the Commissioner, and certainly there was great total consensus with the Commissioner and ourselves, that bill had huge implications for SARS and even went against the original CATS Commission proposals, and that if we wanted to proceed on those lines, it should at least be subject to a proper and rigorous evidence-based approach. Our problem is when we go to committees like Home Affairs and so on in Parliament, they look at it in a particular way, and they're not looking at the broader implications. So that is a risk that we do face, and something certainly I think as the Commission looks at, because even with all the problems in SARS, we're saying it's easier to fix up the customs and excise problem in SARS than split it up and fragment it and put it in other departments or agencies. I think there's greater risk if we were to do that, and it would go against one of the fundamental reforms that the CATS Commission introduced, and that led to, I think, the SARS that we knew in past
bringing
years.
customs into SARS, you mean?
Yes, continuing that way. I think what Dr. Carlson had an interesting point, pointing out though that the one raises 300 billion, the other raises 900 billion. So even the head of Bay and head of Customs and Excise was a bit lopsided at the top. But that you'll deal with Bain and why they came up with that. Just something I noted from his input. What we don't doubt is that Customs and Excise needs someone. Certainly the last person to head it from the EXCO also resigned. What was Jed's surname?
Michelatus.
Yes. And currently it's headed acting by Bears Theron. But that's also an area that needs certainty, particularly in the light of the political uncertainty that's been generated.
I'll ask a question. Mr. Mamoniat, has anyone suggested that since our report, circumstances have changed to make our report wrong?
No, but they've said someone from your legal firm has given advice that it's constitutionally not a problem. Now, of course, we say constitutionally, lots of things are possible. It doesn't mean therefore you should go ahead. It may still be. So that's the only argument that we've heard, okay?
But philosophically, no one said
nobody has said
that our recommendations were wrong.
And let me say, your recommendations were also endorsed by the Davis Tax Committee, which commented on the legislation. So from the tax side, there's been no move to say that shift is okay. But I want to emphasize, we're not saying that we are against mandatory cooperation. We're saying that that's important. What we are saying, that doesn't mean you've got to integrate entire systems and take it away from SARS, because then you're dealing with the big scanners, you're dealing with SARS' ability to go and inspect when somebody is bringing in goods that they shouldn't be bringing in. It certainly will affect them operationally. They'll have to talk to another department. I think it's messy.
What has the rationale been for, or what rationale has been expressed for the proposed move?
I think it came about the need that you've got many authorities around on our borders. You've got certainly not just the customs officials, you've got police, you've got the defense force, you've got Department of Agriculture. You have lots of players and they need to work together. And the model is that you do need much more of a command and control system. So we don't have any issue with broadly what you need to do. But a lot of the fraud is not just what comes through the borders, it's what comes through even electronically. And certainly, and my knowledge on customs is dangerous, but people sign forms or put their declarations well before they actually come. But on some of our borders, people might just pitch up. And if you want to reduce that fraud, and you know, this could be people taking out diamonds illegally. It could be that they bring even diamonds from other African countries into South Africa to somehow legitimize it, contrary to the Kimberley process. I mean, there's a lot of issues, and it would be worth asking the officials at SARS and Customs who deal with these issues. I mean, they would be able to go into the nitty-gritty. But certainly as a department, I think, even at the risk of being very unpopular in Parliament, we've gone and we've made the case, and we can provide the documentation and the note on the risks that we face.
We'd appreciate that. And we do have some input from SARS. We have some input both from the customs people, but also from the enforcement side. We also heard from the South African Freight Association, which I think deals with 90% of the goods that come across the border. They are horrified by this bill. What I understand from SARS is that what the 2014 acts introduced and the modernization process was end-to-end supply chain visibility, both for SARS and for your importers and exporters. And that's what makes the system work, both in terms of the speed of getting things across our borders, but also in terms of enforcement and collecting the right amounts. That you do have this beforehand reporting, and you have communication with other jurisdictions. So you know what's coming and going beforehand, and then your risk engine tells you in advance what to stop in respect of under-declarations as well as possibly illicit goods. And the fear with this act, or this bill, is that it'll impair SARS's ability to have that visibility from start to finish. And that'll impact on, well, as I say, enforcement as well as the efficiency of it. And we heard from the South African Freight Association that just the impact of more inspections, for example, over a particular period, was catastrophic for them and for the economy. And this, for them, puts more of those kind of blockages in the system. So that's in brief what we have from SARS, which I think is pretty much along the same lines as you're suggesting. Is that right?
Yes, and I think just one other issue, as we're trying to fix up particularly the tobacco smuggling and the loss in revenue and so on, okay, I think that you certainly need a more coordinated process to deal with it. But part of our problem, and I think the problems that aren't being looked at, is you can put numerous reports to the hawks, to the police, nothing happens. Okay. Now, perhaps that's getting into the area that the Zondo Commission needs to look at. Why are things not happening? Are the people so politically connected that they've been told that they shouldn't look? So I'm saying this, it gets into very complex issues. I think SARS is good at looking at the issues, following through, and we need to fix up the problems in SARS. But this does have consequences for trade. It has consequences on the criminal syndicates that are promoting this. And not that I think the tobacco industry, that's even saying that they'll get 7 billion rand more. There are vested interests even between the big tobacco and small tobacco that you got to watch.
A rather remarkable document. Anyway, I don't think it's not the appropriate time to raise that. Yep. Can we stop now for lunch?
Can.
And your procurement expert is coming.
We'll make an arrangement and we'll let you know.
Thank you very much.
The boss is here. He'll
Yeah, no,
have
we'll
to.
do that.
But not today, is that what I'm understanding?
Oh, not today.
So in other words, we're closing up now.
Okay, well, now I can say thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Judge. The message from us is very clear, and we are unequivocal about it, that a well-functioning SARS for us is good for democracy, and without it, all the aspirations that we have as a country, we are all finished. And unfortunately, we are at the center of ensuring that happens, because if SARS is not collecting, the country has to run. We'll be forced then to go and borrow for more. And at 60%, other people are already beginning to argue that if Japan can go up to 200% debt to GDP, you as South Africa can go to, but that will be the end of our country. So that, for me, is a key issue, that a well-functioning SARS is good for our democracy. Yeah.
Can I thank you for the excellent submission that you gave, and the boxes of documents that you also delivered, which I've been looking through. Thanks for your cooperation.
You can make them all public if you want, so we don't have a problem.
Oh, good. We'll put them up on the website.
Not the whole box of documents.
No, but at least the submission.
Good you were here, Donna. What with the PFMA? Yes. The constitutional amendments. No, I know you were, that's why.
Mama, thanks. That was great.
Okay, I'm glad.
I'm clear on what I think the government models.
Yeah.
Thank you.